Playing with Power MTG. Powerful cards, powerful formats. Do you have extra cards lying around that you don't use? Want to buy or trade for some extra cards but don't know how to maximize the value? Then you should try out today's sponsor, Card Conduit. Card Conduit is the best service when it comes to selling your extra cards. Don't waste hours trying to find the best buy list price for your cards online. Simply send them to Card Conduit and let them take care of the rest. I have used Card Conduit multiple times already. I always use them to get the best value for my extra cards. I get fair prices for my cards and they save me tons of time. They have three main services. Their standard service lets you send them your unsorted cards of any value. They will sort, grade, and give you the best price for your cards. Their curated service is similar. Send them your unsorted cards worth over $1 in value. They will charge half the fee of the standard service and charge no fee per card. Their sorted service is a great value as well. Choose cards in advance with their selection tool, send them sorted to Card Conduit, and they will grade and buy list them automatically. Save yourself the time of having to send to multiple sites and let Card Conduit do it instead. Their fee is only 2% with no fee per card. They give you the best price for your cards. They work with competitive buy listing partners, including ones not open to the public. Users get an average of 19% more for their collection than they would from any major retail buy list, even with Card Conduit's fees. Card Conduit also optimizes buy listing for card condition as well. Since vendors have different penalties for wear and tear, Card Conduit will find the best buy list priced against the specific condition of the card. So give Card Conduit a try today. If you sign up with my link in the description below or use the promo code POWER, you will also get 10% off of their fees when you use their service. A big thanks to Card Conduit for sponsoring today's video. Welcome to the ultimate CEDH compilation of Kenrith the Return King. Kenrith is the ultimate toolbox commander. It can be explosive, grindy, or controlling. It has multiple combos available using things like Dockside and Phantasmal Image. Its abilities allow for so many different things like drawing out opponents, gaining life for a better Adnos, or even political plays like reanimating opponents' creatures to stop win attempts. Whenever you sit down across from this commander, you never know what you're going to face. Ryan wins the Everyone Feels Sorry for You for Playing Boros challenge and gets to start us off. Ryan draws a card for turn and plays a Marsh Flats. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a plateau onto the battlefield. He casts a Paladin class and passes the turn. Tyler draws a card for turn and plays a Tropical Island. He passes. Zane draws and plays a Mana Confluence. He taps his Confluence to help cast Esper Sentinel. He casts a Jeweled Lotus and gives the turn to Mike. Mike draws and also plays a Mana Confluence. He casts a Chrome Mox. Esper triggers and Mike pays. Chrome Mox enters and Mike imprints Postmortem Lunge. Mike ends his turn. Ryan draws and plays an Arid Mesa. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Sacred Foundry onto the battlefield untapped, paying 2 life. He casts Boros Signet. Esper triggers and Zane draws. Ryan casts a Jeweled Lotus of his own. Ryan ships the turn to Tyler. Tyler draws and plays an Underground Sea. He passes. Zane draws and plays a Tundra. He casts a Mox Opal. He cracks his Jeweled Lotus to help cast his commander, Hinata Dawncrowned. In response, Mike casts Vampiric Tutor. Esper Sentinel triggers and Zane draws. Mike then fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. Hinata resolves and Zane passes the turn. Mike draws and plays a Taiga. He casts a Dockside Extortionist. It enters and Mike creates 5 treasures. He pays 2 life to help cast Birthing Pod. Mike pays 2 life to activate Birthing Pod, sacrificing Dockside and fetching up a Spellseeker onto the battlefield. Spellseeker enters and Mike fetches up a Reanimate into his hand. All through, Mike passes. Ryan draws and casts his commander, Aurelia the War Leader. He moves to combat and attacks Mike with Aurelia. Aurelia triggers and untaps. Mike takes it and then Ryan moves to his next combat, attacking Mike again. Mike takes it again and Ryan passes the turn. Tyler draws and plays an island. Tyler passes. Zane draws and plays a Misty Rainforest. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Volcanic Island onto the battlefield. He casts Ponder. He looks at the top 3, rearranges, and draws. He casts a Mana Crypt. He attacks Mike with Hinata. Mike takes it, and Zane ends his turn. During Mike's upkeep, Zane casts Heliod's Intervention, targeting every artifact and enchantment his opponents control, reduced through Hinata. They are all destroyed, and Mike draws for turn. In his main phase, he taps his Mana Confluence to cast Reanimate, targeting Dockside in his graveyard. Esper triggers and Zane draws. Dockside enters, Mike loses 2, and then he creates 3 treasures. He casts Rhystic Study. In response, Zane casts Intuition. In response, Tyler casts Mana Drain. Esper triggers and Zane draws. In response, Zane casts Deflecting Swat for its alternate cost, targeting Mana Drain. Swat resolves, redirecting Mana Drain to Swat itself. Then Mana Drain fizzles and Intuition resolves. Zane fetches up a Savine's Reclamation, Lion's Eye Diamond, and an Underworld Breach. Mike gives Zane LED and the rest go to his graveyard. Then Rhystic Study resolves. Mike moves to combat and attacks Zane with Spellseeker. Zane takes it and Mike passes the turn. Ryan draws and plays a City of Brass. He attacks Mike with Aurelia, gets an extra combat, and attacks Mike again. Mike takes it both times, and Ryan passes the turn. Tyler draws and plays a Reflecting Pool. He casts Smothering Tithe. Rhystic and Sentinel triggers, and Mike and Zane draw. In response, Zane casts Force of Negation for its alternate cost, exiling a blue card targeting Tithe. Rhystic triggers, and Mike draws. Then Force of Negation counters and exiles Smothering Tithe. Tyler sighs and passes to Zane. During his upkeep, Zane casts Mystical Tutor. Rhystic triggers, and Mike draws. Zane fetches up a Brain Freeze onto the top of his library. He then wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and plays a Polluted Delta. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Hallowed Fountain onto the battlefield untapped, paying 2 life. He casts a Ranger Captain of Eos. Rhystic triggers, and Mike draws. In response, Ryan flashes in a Cathar Commando, and Mike draws through Rhystic. Ranger Captain enters, and Zane fetches up a Ragavan Nimble Pilferer into his hand. Then Zane activates Ranger Captain, sacrificing it, locking out his opponents of non-creature spells this turn. Zane casts Lion's Eye Diamond, and Mike draws through Rhystic. He cracks it, discards his hand, and adds 3 white. He flashes back Savine's Reclamation from his graveyard. Mike draws through Rhystic, and Zane returns Underworld Breach and Lion's Eye Diamond to the battlefield. He cracks LED for 3 blue, and then escapes Brain Freeze from his graveyard with all copies targeting himself. Rhystic triggers, and Mike draws. In response, Ryan taps the City of Brass to help activate Cathar Commando, sacrificing it and targeting Underworld Breach. In response, Zane escapes Deflecting Swat from his graveyard. He changes the target of Commando to Rhystic Study, destroying it. Then Brain Freeze resolves, and Zane mills. Zane presents a loop of escaping LED, cracking it for 3 blue, then escaping Brain Freeze, milling himself out. He then mills out all of his opponents. When he mills out Mike, Zane notices that Mike milled Memory's Journey, which is a huge problem because Mike can untap and win. So, Zane escapes Twin Flame from his graveyard, holds priority, and escapes Dualcaster Mage from his graveyard, copying Twin Flame. He presents another loop of creating infinite hasty Dualcasters, attacks everyone with all of them, and then Zane wins the game. But Mike has a pre-game action and puts Gemstone Caverns onto the battlefield, exiling Misty Rainforest. Tyler draws and casts a Mox Diamond, discarding Tarnished Citadel. He plays a Scalding Tarn and passes the turn. Zane draws and plays a Tundra. He casts a Soul Ring. He casts an Arcane Signet. He passes. Mike draws and plays a Polluted Delta. He casts a Lotus Petal. He cracks his Polluted Delta, pays a life, and fetches up an Underground Sea onto the battlefield. He casts Ignoble Hierarch. He casts his commander, Thrasios, Triton Hero. Mike ends his turn. Ryan draws and plays a Flooded Strand. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Plateau onto the battlefield. He casts Chrome Mox, Imprinting Fighter class. He casts Drannith Magistrate. Everyone groans, and Tyler responds by casting Enlightened Tutor. In response, Zane pays 2 life to cast Mental Misstep, countering Enlightened Tutor. Drannith resolves, and Ryan passes to Tyler. At the end of Ryan's turn, Tyler cracks his Scalding Tarn, pays a life, and fetches up a Tundra onto the battlefield. And then Ryan eats his dinner. Tyler draws and plays a Polluted Delta. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Tropical Island onto the battlefield. He casts Regrowth, returning Enlightened Tutor to his hand. Tyler passes. Zane draws and casts Gamble. In response, Tyler recasts his Enlightened Tutor. He fetches up a Rhystic Study onto the top of his library. Then Zane fetches up a card into his hand and randomly discards a Force of Will. Zane then surprisingly casts a Rhystic Study of his own. The table has a sensible chuckle, and Zane gives the turn to Mike. Mike draws and casts a Dockside Extortionist. Rhystic triggers, and Mike pays. Dockside resolves, and Mike creates 5 treasures. He casts Aether Vial, and Zane draws through Rhystic. Mike passes the turn. Ryan draws and plays a Snow-Covered Mountain. He casts a Gamble of his own, paying the Rhystic tax. He fetches up a card into his hand, and then randomly discards a Skyclave Apparition. He casts a Mana Crypt, and Zane draws through Rhystic. Ryan casts Recruiter of the Guard, and Zane draws through Rhystic. Recruiter enters, and Ryan fetches up a Dockside Extortionist into his hand. Ryan ends his turn. Tyler draws and casts Rhystic Study. Zane's Study triggers, and he draws. In response, Zane casts Force of Negation for its alternate cost, exiling a blue card. Tyler's Study is countered and exiled, and Tyler passes the turn. Zane draws and casts a Felwar Stone. Zane passes. During his upkeep, Mike puts a counter onto Aether Vial. He draws and moves to combat. He attacks Zane with Thrasios. Ignoble Hierarch's Exalted triggers, giving Thrasios +1/+1. Zane takes it, and Mike ships the turn to Ryan. During his upkeep, Ryan wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and casts a Dockside Extortionist. Rhystic triggers, and Zane draws. In response, Zane flashes in a Dress Down. It enters, and Zane draws again. Ryan begins to ask why Mike gets a Dockside in 4 colors, but Ryan does it in Boros colors. Then Dockside resolves, but doesn't create any treasures due to Dress Down. An incredibly salty Ryan passes to Tyler. At the end of Ryan's turn, Dress Down is sacrificed. Tyler draws, takes no actions, and passes. Zane draws and casts an Esper Sentinel. He casts a Dockside Extortionist of his own. It enters, and in response, Mike cracks his treasure's floating mana. Then Zane creates 4 treasures. He casts Abeyance, targeting Mike. In response, Mike activates Thrasios, scrying 1 and revealing a Mana Crypt into his hand. Mike also activates Aether Vial, putting Elvish Mystic onto the battlefield. Then Abeyance resolves, and Zane draws a card. Zane casts a Mana Crypt. He casts a Twin Flame, targeting his Dockside Extortionist. He holds priority and flashes in a Dualcaster Mage. No one has any responses, and Dualcaster resolves. Zane presents a loop of making infinite hasty Dualcasters, attacking the table, and wins the game. Zane draws and plays a City of Brass. He taps the City of Brass to help cast an Esper Sentinel. Zane passes. Mike draws and plays a Bloodstained Mire. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Bayou onto the battlefield. He casts an Ignoble Hierarch and gives the turn to Ryan. Ryan draws and plays a Prismatic Vista. He casts a Lotus Petal. Sentinel triggers and Zane draws. He cracks his Vista, pays a life, and fetches up a Snow-Covered Plains onto the battlefield. He casts Steel Shaper's Gift. He fetches up a Sword of Hearth and Home into his hand and gives the turn to Tyler. Tyler draws and plays a Hallowed Fountain into play untapped, paying 2 life. He casts an Esper Sentinel of his own. The table realizes it's going to be one of those games, and Tyler ends his turn. Zane draws and plays a Bloodstained Mire. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Volcanic Island onto the battlefield. He casts Gamble. He fetches up a card into his hand and then randomly discards a Dress Down. The table cheers, especially Ryan, and then Zane casts a Mana Crypt. Zane ends his turn. Mike draws and plays an Ancient Tomb. He casts an Elvish Mystic. Mike passes. Ryan draws and plays an Urza Saga, getting its first counter. He casts a Dockside Extortionist. It enters, and Ryan creates 3 treasures. He casts Sword of Hearth and Home. Both Sentinels trigger, and Ryan pays for Zane's, and Tyler draws. Swords resolves, and Ryan ships the turn to Tyler. Tyler draws and plays a Watery Grave into play untapped, paying 2 life. He casts Dark Confidant. He attacks Zane with his Sentinel. Zane takes it, and Tyler passes. During his upkeep, Zane wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and plays a Mana Confluence. He taps his Mana Confluence and his City of Brass and exiles Simeon's Spirit Guide to help cast his commander, Hinata, Dawncrowned. In response, Mike casts Force of Will, exiling a blue card and paying 1 life. Both Sentinels trigger, and Mike taps his Ancient Tomb to pay for both of them. Hinata is countered, and Zane follows up by casting Mystic Remora. In response, Mike casts Demonic Consultation. It resolves, and Mike names Dockside Extortionist. He exiles the top 6, and then exiles until he finds it, and then puts it into his hand. Then Remora resolves, and Zane passes to Mike. Mike draws and casts Dockside Extortionist. It enters, and Mike creates 6 treasures. He casts his commander, Thrasios, Triton Hero. He casts Finehorn Elves. Mike passes. Ryan draws, and in his first main phase, Urza Saga gets another counter. He plays a Plateau for turn. He equips Sword of Hearth and Home onto his Dockside Extortionist. He attacks Zane with his Dockside. Zane takes it, and Sword of Hearth and Home trigger. Ryan exiles Dockside and then fetches up a Snow-Covered Mountain. He then puts both onto the battlefield. Dockside triggers, and Ryan creates 8 treasures. In his second main phase, Ryan casts Oswald Fiddlebender. He casts an Archon of Emeria. Ryan passes to Tyler. During his upkeep, Tyler reveals a regrowth through Dark Confidant. He draws and plays a Breeding Pool into play tapped. He casts Mystic Remora. Zane's Remora and Sentinel trigger. Tyler pays for Sentinel, and Zane draws through Remora. In response to Tyler's Remora, Mike taps his Ancient Tomb to cast Winds of Rebuke, targeting his own Dockside. Both Sentinels and Remora trigger. Mike pays for the Sentinels, and Zane draws through Remora. Then Winds resolves, Dockside bounces, and everyone mills too. Then Tyler's Mystic Remora resolves. He attacks Zane with Esper Sentinel and Dark Confidant. Zane takes it, and Tyler gives the turn to Zane. During his upkeep, Zane loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He pays to keep his Remora. He draws and plays an Ancient Tomb into play tap through Archon. Zane passes. Mike draws and casts Dockside Extortionist. It enters, and Mike creates 10 treasures. Locked out by Archon, Mike passes. During Ryan's upkeep, to prevent him from winning the game, Zane taps his Mana Confluence to cast Silence. Tyler's Remora and Sentinel trigger. Zane pays for Sentinel, and Tyler draws through Remora. Silence resolves, locking Ryan out of casting spells this turn. He draws, and Urza Saga gets his final counter. Ryan sacrifices it and fetches up an Esper Sentinel onto the battlefield, which he isn't able to do. No one else caught it, and you should all go to the comments and tell Ryan what a bad Magic player he is. Anyway, Ryan plays a Sunbaked Canyon for turn. He equips Sword of Hearth and Home to his Dockside. He attacks Zane with Dockside again. Zane takes it, and Sword triggers. Ryan exiles Dockside and fetches up a Snow-Covered Plains. He puts both onto the battlefield, and Dockside triggers. In response, Mike cracks his treasures to activate Thrasios, scrying 1 and revealing a Taiga onto the battlefield tapped. He cracks more treasures to activate Thrasios again, scrying 1 and revealing a Dauthi Voidwalker into his hand. Then Dockside's ability resolves, and Ryan creates 9 treasures. In his second main phase, Ryan activates Oswald Fiddlebender, sacrificing a treasure and fetching up an Aether Vial onto the battlefield. All finished up, Ryan passes. During his upkeep, Tyler reveals a Chrome Mox through Dark Confidant. Still in his upkeep, he pays for his Mystic Remora. He draws and plays an Ancient Tomb into play tapped. He casts Ponder, Zane's Remora and Sentinel trigger, and he draws 2. Then Ponder resolves, Tyler looks at the top 3, doesn't like what he sees, shuffles, and draws. Finish casting his 1 spell per turn, Tyler passes. During his upkeep, Zane loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He pays to keep his Remora. He draws and plays a Sea of Clouds into play tapped. He taps his Mana Confluence and his Ancient Tomb to help transmute Muddle the Mixture. He fetches up a Drannith Magistrate into his hand. He taps the City of Brass to help cast Drannith Magistrate, much to the chagrin of Ryan. It resolves and Zane passes the turn. At the end of Zane's turn, Mike taps his Ancient Tomb to help activate Thrasios, scrying 1 and revealing a Divining Witch into his hand. Mike draws and casts Dauthi Voidwalker. He passes. At the end of Mike's turn, Ryan casts Swords to Plowshares, targeting Drannith Magistrate. Tyler's and Zane's Remoras and Sentinels all trigger. Ryan pays for the Sentinels and they all draw through the Remoras. Then Drannith is exiled and Zane gains 1. The turn moves to Ryan. During his upkeep, Ryan puts a charge counter onto Aether Vial. He draws and casts his commander, Aurelia the War Leader. In response, Mike taps his Ancient Tomb to help activate Thrasios, scrying and revealing a Tainted Pact into his hand. Mike, wanting his opponents to draw into interaction, responds by casting Vampiric Tutor. Ryan's Sentinel, Tyler's Sentinel and Remora, and Zane's Sentinel and Remora all trigger. Mike lets Tyler and Zane both draw 2 cards each, and then he pays for Ryan's Sentinel. Unfortunately, neither drew into the interaction that they can use, and Vampiric Tutor resolves. Mike fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. Then Aurelia resolves. Ryan equips Sword of Hearth and Home to his Archon of Emeria. He presents a loop of attacking with his Archon and Aurelia, getting in extra combat, flickering Aurelia through Sword, and repeating. He repeats this loop over and over until his opponents are dead, and Ryan wins the game.
Tyler was able to sing the ABCs backwards the fastest and gets to start us off. Tyler draws and plays a Mana Confluence. He taps his Confluence to cast Noble Hierarch. He passes. Zach draws and plays a Verdant Catacombs. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up an Underground Sea onto the battlefield. He casts Deathrite Shaman. He ends the turn. Cal draws and plays a Misty Rainforest. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Tropical Island onto the battlefield. He casts Jeweled Lotus. He cracks his Lotus to cast his commander, Rashmi, Eternity's Crafter. Cal gives the turn to Steven. Steven draws and plays a Bloodstained Mire. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up an Underground Sea onto the battlefield. He casts Imperial Seal. He fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. He ends his turn. Tyler draws and plays Rejuvenating Springs. He casts a Mana Crypt. He casts Grim Monolith. He casts Ponder. He looks at the top 3 cards of his library, rearranges, and draws. He taps his Mana Confluence to cast Noble Hierarch. All finished up, Tyler passes. Zach draws and casts Felwar Stone. He casts Dark Ritual, adding 3 black. He casts his commander, Armix, Filigree Thrasher. He passes. Cal draws and plays a Prismatic Vista. He ends his turn. Steven draws and plays a Watery Grave into play untapped, paying 2 life. He casts a Soul Ring. He casts Dark Ritual, adding 3 black. He follows it up with a Doomsday. In response, Cal cracks his Prismatic Vista, pays a life, and fetches up an island onto the battlefield. Cal casts Mana Drain targeting Doomsday. Rashmi triggers, revealing Mox Diamond into Cal's hand. Doomsday is countered, and with nothing else, Steven gives the turn to Tyler. During his upkeep, Tyler loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays a Tarnished Citadel. He casts Vexing Shusher. He casts his commander, Kenrith, the Return King. Tyler ends his turn. Zach draws and pays 2 life to help cast Phyrexian Metamorph. It enters as a copy of Rashmi. He moves to combat and attacks Cal with Armix. Armix triggers, and Zach discards Isochron Scepter, giving Cal's Rashmi -4/-4 until end of turn, killing it. Cal then takes the hit, and with nothing else, Zach passes. Cal draws, and in his first main phase, he adds 3 colorless mana for Mana Drain. He plays an Ancient Tomb. He taps Ancient Tomb to recast Rashmi. It enters, and Cal ends the turn. Steven draws, does nothing, and passes. During his upkeep, Tyler loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays a Misty Rainforest. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Tropical Island onto the battlefield. He activates Kenrith, drawing a card. Tyler ends the turn. Zach draws and casts Arcane Signet. Rashmi triggers and reveals Dispel, putting it into his hand. He casts his other commander, Thrasios, Triton Hero. Zach ends his turn. Cal draws and plays a Turn Timber Serpentine Wood into play tapped. He passes. Steven draws and casts Mystic Remora. In response, Zach pays 2 life to cast Mental Misstep targeting Remora. Rashmi triggers and reveals Vampiric Tutor into his hand. Remora is countered, and with nothing else, Steven passes. At the end of Steven's turn, Tyler taps his Mana Confluence to untap Grim Monolith. The turn moves to Tyler. During his upkeep, Tyler wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and plays Yavimaya Coast. He casts Wild Growth, targeting Tarnished Citadel. It enters, and Tyler activates Kenrith, drawing a card. He casts Dockside Extortionist. It enters and creates 5 treasures. He taps Mana Confluence to cast Eladamri's Call. He fetches up a Seedborn Muse into his hand. He casts Seedborn Muse. Tyler holds his breath as priority passes around the table, and Seedborn resolves. Sitting in a really nice spot, Tyler passes the turn. Tyler untaps with Zach. During his upkeep, Zach casts Vampiric Tutor. Rashmi triggers, and in response, Tyler casts Narset's Reversal, targeting Vampiric Tutor. Tutor is bounced to Zach's hand, and Tyler creates a copy of Vampiric Tutor. Tyler fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. Rashmi's trigger resolves, revealing a Lotus Petal. Zach casts Lotus Petal. Still in the upkeep, Zach recasts Vampiric Tutor. He fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. Zach then finally draws for the turn and casts Talisman of Dominance. He taps the Talisman to cast Dothy Voidwalker. It resolves, and he moves to combat. He attacks Steven with Armix and Rashmi. Armix triggers, and Zach declines to discard. Steven takes the hit, and Zach passes the turn. At the end of Zach's turn, Tyler taps his Yavimaya Coast to activate Kenrith 2 times, drawing 2 cards. Still in the end step, Cal casts Worldly Tutor. Rashmi triggers, and he reveals Counterbalance into his hand. Cal then starts to search his library for a specific card. He searches for his Gilded Drake, but can't seem to find it. He knows it's in his deck list and assumes that it's in another deck, and he just forgot to put it back in. We would come to find out later it was accidentally shuffled into Comedian MTG's deck back at MTG Vegas. So, not being able to find his Drake, Cal has to change up his plan and fetches up a Wandering Archaic onto the top of his library. Worldly Tutor is exiled to Dothy, and the turn finally moves to Cal. Tyler untaps with Cal. Cal draws and taps his Ancient Tomb to cast Wandering Archaic. Rashmi triggers, revealing Noxious Revival. Cal casts Noxious Revival, targeting Mana Drain in his graveyard. Mana Drain is put onto the top of his library, and Revival is exiled to Dothy. Cal moves to combat, attacking Steven with Rashmi. Steven takes the hit, and Cal ends his turn. At the end of Cal's turn, Tyler taps his Yavimaya Coast to activate Kenrith 2 times. In response, Steven pays 2 life to cast a Noxious Revival of his own, targeting Mystic Remora in his graveyard. Wandering Archaic triggers, and Steven pays. Remora goes to the top of his library, and Revival is exiled to Dothy. Tyler draws from his Kenrith activations, and still in the end step, Tyler activates Kenrith, drawing a card. The turn then moves to Steven. Tyler untaps with Steven. Steven draws and casts Mystic Remora. In response, Tyler flashes in Opposition Agent. Agent resolves, and then Remora resolves. With nothing else, Steven gives the turn to Tyler. At the end of Steven's turn, Tyler activates Kenrith, drawing a card. The turn then moves to Tyler. During his upkeep, Tyler loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays a Forbidden Orchard. He casts Deadeye Navigator. It enters and soul bonds to Dockside. He activates Deadeye, flickering Dockside. Dockside exiles and enters, creating 7 treasures and soul bonding with Deadeye. He presents a loop of cracking 2 treasures to activate Deadeye, flickering Dockside, and generating 5 treasures with each iteration. He creates infinite treasures. He activates Kenrith, drawing cards until he finds what he's looking for. He casts an overloaded Cyclonic Rift. Wandering Archaic and Remora trigger, Tyler pays for both. Rift resolves, bouncing each of his opponent's non-land permanents to their hands. Tyler then activates Kenrith over and over, drawing out each of his opponents, and wins the game. Zach draws and plays an Underground Sea. He casts Mox Diamond, discarding Gemstone Caverns. He casts a turn 1 Counterbalance. The table groans and it resolves. Zach ends his turn. Cal draws and plays an island. He casts Mystic Remora. Counterbalance triggers and reveals a Watery Grave. Remora resolves, and Cal ships the turn. Steven draws and plays a Flooded Strand. He passes. Tyler draws and plays a Scalding Tarn. He ends the turn. Zach draws and plays a Wooded Foothills. He casts his commander, Thrasios, Triton Hero. Zach gives the turn to Cal. During his upkeep, Cal pays for his Remora. He draws and plays an island. Cal ends his turn. At the end of Cal's turn, Steven cracks Flooded Strand and pays a life. In response, Tyler cracks his Scalding Tarn, pays a life, and fetches up a volcanic island onto the battlefield. Steven then fetches up an underground sea onto the battlefield, and then the turn moves to Steven. Steven draws and casts Mana Crypt. Remora triggers and Cal draws. Counterbalance triggers and Zach reveals a Flusterstorm. Crypt resolves and Steven follows it up with a Dark Confidant. Steven passes. Tyler draws and plays a Rejuvenating Springs. He casts Vexing Shusher. With nothing else, Tyler ends his turn. Zach draws and plays a Watery Grave into play untapped to pay 2 life. He passes. During his upkeep, Cal lets his Remora die. He draws and plays an island. He casts Rhystic Study. Counterbalance triggers and Zach reveals a Rhystic Study. The table erupts and Cal's Rhystic is countered. A little saddened, Cal gives the turn to Steven. During his upkeep, Steven loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He reveals Post-Mortem Lunge through Dark Confidant, losing 1 life. He draws and casts Lotus Petal. He casts Chrome Mox. It enters and he imprints Post-Mortem Lunge. He casts Brainstorm. He draws 3 and puts 2 back on top. He plays Cavern of Souls, naming Human as it enters. He cracks his petal to cast Mystic Remora. Counterbalance triggers, and in response, Zach exiles Elvish Spirit Guide, adding a green. He activates Thrasios, scrying 1 and revealing Rhystic Study, drawing it. Counterbalance reveals a Mystical Tutor countering Remora. Steven gives the turn to Tyler. Tyler draws and casts Mana Crypt. He casts Lotus Petal. He cracks his petal for a white and casts his commander, Kenrith, the Return King. He passes. Zach draws and casts Rhystic Study. It resolves and Zach ends his turn. Cal draws and plays an island. He casts Teferi, Master of Time. Rhystic and Counterbalance trigger. Counterbalance reveals a Mana Confluence and Zach draws a card. Teferi enters and Cal activates Teferi's first ability, drawing and discarding. Cal ships the turn. During his upkeep, Steven wins his Mana Crypt roll. He reveals Finhorn Elves through Dark Confidant, losing 1 life. He draws and moves to combat. He attacks Teferi with Dark Confidant. Before damage, Cal activates Teferi's first ability, drawing and discarding. Teferi takes the hit, and with nothing else, Steven passes. During his upkeep, Tyler wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and moves to combat. He attacks Teferi with Kenrith. Before damage, Cal activates Teferi's first ability, drawing and discarding. Teferi takes the hit and dies. In his second main phase, Tyler casts Gamble. Rhystic and Counterbalance trigger. Zach reveals Phyrexian Metamorph and draws the Rhystic. Tyler fetches up a card into his hand and discards a card at random, which is a Chain of Vapor. Tyler casts a Rhystic Study of his own. Rhystic and Counterbalance trigger. In response, Zach cracks his Wooded Foothills, pays a life, and fetches up a tropical island onto the battlefield. He casts a Mystical Tutor. He fetches up a Fierce Guardianship onto the top of his library. Counterbalance reveals Fierce Guardianship, countering Rhystic. Zach then draws through Rhystic, and Tyler ends the turn. Zach draws and plays a Mana Confluence. He passes. Cal draws and plays a Turn Timber Serpentine Wood into play untapped, paying 3 life. He casts his commander, Rashmi, Eternity's Crafter. Rhystic and Counterbalance trigger. Zach doesn't reveal for Counterbalance, and Cal pays for Rhystic. Cal gives the turn to Steven. During his upkeep, Steven loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He reveals Dread Return through Dark Confidant and loses 4 life. He draws and passes. At the end of Steven's turn, Zach casts Assassin's Trophy targeting Kenrith. Kenrith is destroyed and Tyler fetches up an island onto the battlefield. The turn then moves to Tyler. During his upkeep, Tyler loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and casts Whirlpool Warrior. Rhystic and Counterbalance trigger. Counterbalance reveals an Arcane Signet, and Zach draws. Warrior enters and triggers. Tyler shuffles his hand into his library and draws 3 cards. He plays an Overgrown Tomb into play untapped, paying 2 life. Tyler passes. Zach draws and pays 2 life to cast Phyrexian Metamorph. It enters as a copy of Rashmi. Zach passes. Cal draws and casts Chrome Mox. Rashmi, Rhystic, and Counterbalance trigger. Counterbalance reveals a Breeding Pool, countering Chrome Mox. Cal pays for Rhystic, and Rashmi reveals Jace, Wielder of Mysteries, putting it into his hand. With nothing else, Cal passes. During his upkeep, Steven wins his Mana Crypt roll. He reveals a Bloodstained Mire through Dark Confidant. He draws and plays a Bloodstained Mire. He cracks it and pays a life. In response, Tyler casts an Opposition Agent. Counterbalance and Rhystic trigger. Zack draws and reveals Mnemonic Betrayal, countering opposition agent. Steven fetches up a Bayou onto the battlefield and follows it up with a Finhorn Elves. Counterbalance and Rhystic trigger. Steven pays for Rhystic and Zack doesn't reveal for counterbalance. All finished up, Steven passes. During his upkeep, Tyler wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and casts Mystic Remora, Counterbalance and Rhystic trigger. He pays for Rhystic, and in response to Counterbalance, Zack pays 2 life to cast Mental Misstep targeting Remora. Rashmi triggers, and in response, Tyler activates Vexing Shusher targeting Mystic Remora, making it uncounterable. Rashmi reveals Mnemonic Betrayal into Zack's hand. Mental Misstep fizzles, and Zack doesn't reveal for Counterbalance. Remora resolves, and with an impactful spell finally resolving, Tyler gives the turn to Zack. Zack draws and plays a Breeding Pool into play untapped, paying 2 life. He moves to combat and attacks Tyler with Rashmi. Tyler takes the hit, and Zack passes. Cal draws and passes. During his upkeep, Steven wins his Mana Crypt roll. He reveals Ancient Tomb through Dark Confidant. He draws and plays an Ancient Tomb. He casts his commander, CEDH Brood Tyrant. Counterbalance and Rhystic trigger. He pays for Rhystic, and Zack doesn't reveal for Counterbalance. CEDH enters, and Steven mills 3 cards. He ends the turn. During his upkeep, Tyler loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He pays for Remora and draws. He casts Regrowth targeting Rhystic Study in his graveyard. Rhystic Study and Counterbalance trigger. In response, Tyler activates Vexing Shusher, making Regrowth uncounterable. Zack doesn't reveal for Counterbalance and draws through Rhystic. Tyler returns Rhystic Study to his hand and plays a Fiery Islet. He taps Islet to cast Rhystic Study. Rhystic and Counterbalance trigger. Zack reveals Vampiric Tutor and draws through Rhystic. With Tyler's Rhystic still on the stack, Zack activates Thrasios, scrying 1 and revealing Ancient Tomb into play tapped. Zack casts Fierce Guardianship for its alternative cost targeting Rhystic Study. Remora and Rashmi trigger. Tyler draws and Zack reveals Dark Confidant, casting it. Confidant enters and Rhystic is countered. With Zack shutting down nearly every play, Tyler passes. During his upkeep, Zack reveals Chain of Vapor through Dark Confidant and loses 1 life. He draws and plays Cephalid Colosseum. He casts Eldritch Evolution, sacrificing Rashmi as an additional cost. Remora triggers and Tyler draws. In response, Cal casts Force of Will, paying a life and exiling a blue card. Rashmi, Remora, Rhystic, and Counterbalance all trigger. In response, Zack casts Vampiric Tutor. Remora triggers and Tyler draws. In response, Cal pays 2 life to cast Mental Misstep targeting Vampiric Tutor. Remora, Rhystic, and Counterbalance trigger. Zack reveals Dothy Voidwalker and Cal pays for Rhystic Study. Tyler draws from Remora, and in response to Mental Misstep, Zack taps Cephalid Colosseum to cast Dispel targeting Mental Misstep. Remora triggers and Tyler draws. Dispel counters Misstep, and Zack fetches up a card onto the top of his library, losing 2 life. Counterbalance reveals Force of Will, countering Cal's Force of Will. Cal pays for Rhystic, and Tyler draws from Remora. With Rashmi's trigger still on the stack, Zack taps Ancient Tomb and Mana Confluence to activate Thrasios, scrying 1 and revealing Force of Will into his hand. Rashmi's trigger resolves, revealing Paradigm Shift, putting it into Cal's hand. Eldritch Evolution finally resolves, and Zack fetches up a Seedborn Muse onto the battlefield. Zack gives the turn to Cal. At the end of Zack's turn, Cal casts Reality Shift targeting Seedborn Muse. Remora, Rhystic, and Counterbalance all trigger. Zack reveals Mana Crypt, and Cal pays for Rhystic. Tyler draws, and in response to Reality Shift, Zack casts Force of Will, paying a life and exiling a blue card. Remora triggers, and Tyler draws. Reality Shift is countered, and the turn moves to Cal. Zack untaps with Cal. Cal draws, does nothing, and passes the turn. At the end of Cal's turn, Zack activates Thrasios, scrying 1, and reveals Crop Rotation into his hand. The turn moves to Steven. Zack untaps with Steven. During his upkeep, Steven wins his Mana Crypt roll. He reveals Elvish Spirit Guide through Dark Confidant, losing 3 life. He draws and moves to combat. He attacks Zack with CEDH. CEDH triggers, milling 3 cards. Zack blocks with Dark Confidant and Seedborn Muse. Dark Confidant and CEDH die, and Steven passes the turn. At the end of Steven's turn, Zack taps his Ancient Tomb to activate Thrasios, scrying 1 and revealing Polluted Delta into play tapped. He taps Cephalid Colosseum to activate Thrasios, scrying 1 and revealing Forbidden Orchard into play tapped. The turn moves to Tyler. Zach untaps with Tyler. During his upkeep, Tyler wins his mana crypt roll and pays for Remora. He draws and plays a Tundra. He casts Drannith Magistrate. Rhystic and Counterbalance trigger. Zach reveals Cyclonic Rift, countering Drannith. Zach draws from Rhystic and Tyler follows it up with an Arcane Signet. Rhystic and Counterbalance trigger. Zach reveals Windswept Heath and draws from Rhystic. Tyler taps his Fiery Islet to cast Time Twister. Rhystic and Counterbalance trigger. Zach reveals Pact of Negation and draws from Rhystic. In response to Time Twister, Zach casts Flusterstorm with all copies targeting Time Twister. Remora triggers and Tyler draws. Time Twister is countered and Tyler passes the turn. At the end of Tyler's turn, Zach cracks his Polluted Delta, pays a life, and fetches up a Bayou onto the battlefield. He activates Thrasios, scrying 1 and revealing Demonic Consultation into his hand. He taps his Ancient Tomb and Forbidden Orchard, giving Callous Spirit to activate Thrasios, scrying 1 and revealing Morphic Pool into play tapped. The turn then moves to Zach. Zach draws and starts off his turn by casting Mnemonic Betrayal. Remora triggers and Tyler draws. In response, Cal casts Fierce Guardianship for its alternative cost, targeting Betrayal. Rashmi, Remora, Rhystic, and Counterbalance all trigger. Zach reveals Culling the Weak and draws from Rhystic. Tyler draws from Remora, and with Rashmi's trigger still on the stack, Zach casts Pact of Negation, targeting Fierce Guardianship. Remora triggers and Tyler draws. In response, Steven casts Swansong, targeting Pact of Negation. Remora, Counterbalance, and Rhystic trigger. Steven pays for Rhystic, and Zach reveals Brainstorm, countering Swansong. Steven taps his Ancient Tomb to pay for Tyler's Remora. Pact counters Fierce, and Cal reveals Prismatic Vista through Rashmi, putting it into his hand. Mnemonic Betrayal resolves, exiling each of his opponent's graveyards and allowing Zach to cast them this turn. Zach taps his Ancient Tomb to cast Gamble from Tyler's graveyard. Remora triggers and Tyler draws. Zach fetches up a card into his hand and discards a card at random, which is an Arcane Signet. He casts Deathrite Shaman. He follows it up with a Thassa's Oracle. Oracle enters, and with the trigger on the stack, Zach taps Forbidden Orchard, giving Callous Spirit to cast Demonic Consultation. Remora triggers and Tyler draws. Zach names Hypnox as Consultation resolves and exiles his library. Thassa's Oracle's trigger then resolves, and Zach wins the game.
Jay draws and plays a Plateau. He casts a Mana Crypt. He passes. Daquan draws and plays an Exotic Orchard. He casts a Mana Vault. He ships the turn to Zach. Zach draws and pays 2 life to cast Ataxian Probe, targeting Catherine. He looks at Catherine's hand and draws a card. He plays a Tundra for turn. He exiles Simian Spirit Guide, adding a red, and casts Ragavan, Nimble Pilferer. He gives the turn to Catherine. Catherine draws and casts the Lotus Petal. She casts her commander, Rograk, son of Roga. She passes to Jay. During Jay's upkeep, he wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and plays an Otawara, Soaring City as his land for turn. He gives the turn to Daquan. Daquan draws and plays a Windswept Heath. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Bayou onto the battlefield. He exiles Elvish Spirit Guide from his hand, adding a green. He casts Culling Ritual. In response, Zach casts Swansong. Culling Ritual is countered, Catherine thanks Zach, and Daquan creates a 2/2 bird. Next, Daquan casts a Phantasmal Image. It enters as a copy of Ragavan. Daquan ships the turn. Zach draws and moves to combat. He attacks Jay with Ragavan. Jay takes it, Ragavan triggers, and Jay exiles a Wishclaw Talisman, and then Zach creates a treasure. In his second main phase, Zach casts a Wishclaw Talisman from exile. He passes to Catherine. Catherine draws, takes no game actions, and passes, discarding to hand size. During his upkeep, Jay loses his Mana Crypt flip and takes 3 damage. He draws and casts Dockside Extortionist. It enters, and Jay creates 3 treasures. He casts Ad Nauseam. Without a fight, Ad Nauseam resolves. Jay reveals a Chrome Mox, Enlightened Tutor, Jeweled Lotus, Vampiric Tutor, Scrubland, Marsh Flats, Mental Misstep, Esper Sentinel, Badlands, Brain Freeze, Culling the Weak, Drannith Magistrate, Swords to Plowshares, Simian Spirit Guide, Underground Sea, Ancient Tomb, Arid Mesa, Dark Ritual, Talisman of Progress, Luxury Suite, Windswept Heath, Time Twister, Wooded Foothills, Demonic Consultation, Spell Pierce, Savine's Reclamation, Mystical Tutor, Scalding Tarn, Silence, Cabal Ritual, Morphic Pool, and a Felwar Stone, deciding to stop there. He casts Culling the Weak, sacrificing Dockside as an additional cost, adding 4 black. He plays an Underground Sea for turn. He casts a Dark Ritual, adding 3 black. He exiles Simian Spirit Guide from his hand, adding a red. He casts Peer into the Abyss. Peer resolves, Jay draws half of his remaining library and loses half of his life, rounded up. He casts a Mox Diamond, discarding a Tundra. He casts Mox Opal. He casts Chrome Mox, imprinting Time Twister. He casts Thassa's Oracle. In response, Catherine cracks her Lotus Petal for red and then casts Red Elemental Blast, targeting Thassa's Oracle, which was the first blue spell of the turn. In response, Jay casts Pact of Negation, countering Red Elemental Blast. Thassa's Oracle resolves, and with a trigger on the stack, Jay casts Demonic Consultation. He names You Are Already Dead and exiles his library. Thassa's Oracle's trigger resolves, and Jay wins the game. But Catherine has a pre-game action, putting Gemstone Caverns onto the battlefield, exiling a Pyroblast. Jay draws and casts a Jeweled Lotus. He sacrifices it to cast his commander, Yisan the Wanderer Bard. He plays a Forest for turn. He casts Llanowar Elves. He passes. Catherine draws and casts her commander, Rograk, son of Roga. She casts Mox Amber. She casts a Mana Vault. She casts a Mox Opal. All set up, Catherine ships the turn to Daquan. Daquan draws and plays a Volcanic Island. He casts a Gamble. He fetches up a card into his hand and then randomly discards a Tropical Island. He casts a Lion's Eye Diamond. Daquan passes the turn to Alan. Alan draws and plays a Taiga. He casts a Birds of Paradise. Alan gives the turn to Jay. Jay draws and plays a Forest. He casts a Mana Crypt. He casts a Soul Ring. He passes. At the end of Jay's turn, Catherine casts a Demonic Consultation, naming Thassa's Oracle as it resolves. She exiles cards from the top of her library until she reveals Thassa's Oracle, putting it into her hand. The turn moves to Catherine. Catherine draws and casts a Springleaf Drum. In response, Jay activates Yisan for 1, fetching up a Quirion Ranger onto the battlefield. He activates Quirion Ranger, bouncing a Forest to his hand, untapping Yisan. Jay activates Yisan for 2. In response, knowing what's coming, Catherine floats a black and a red. Then Jay fetches up a Collector Roof onto the battlefield. Then Springleaf Drum resolves. Catherine casts her commander, Silas Wren, Seeker Adept. Catherine passes the turn. Daquan draws and plays a Scalding Tarn. He gives the turn to Alan. Alan draws and plays a Verdant Catacombs. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Savannah onto the battlefield. He suspends a Greater Gargadon. Alan ships the turn to Jay. During Jay's upkeep, he loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays a Forest. He moves to combat and attacks Alan with Collector Roof. Alan takes it, and the turn moves to Catherine. During the draw step, Catherine takes a damage from her Mana Vault. She plays a Scalding Tarn for turn. She cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Volcanic Island onto the battlefield. She passes. Daquan draws and plays a Misty Rainforest. He gives the turn to Alan. Alan draws and plays a Command Tower. He casts an Arcane Signet. He casts a Durannith Magistrate. He passes. At the end of Alan's turn, Jay activates Yisan for 3. He fetches up a Circle of Dreams Druid onto the battlefield. During his upkeep, Jay casts Worldly Tutor. He fetches up a Dosen, the Falling Leaf, onto the top of his library. Also during his upkeep, he wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and taps his Circle of Dreams Druid to help cast Dosen, the Falling Leaf. In response, Daquan cracks his Scalding Tarn, pays a life, and fetches up a Badlands onto the battlefield. He cracks his Misty Rainforest, pays a life, and fetches up a Bayou onto the battlefield. He casts Dark Ritual. Jay knows what's coming, so in response, Jay activates Quirion Ranger, bouncing a Forest back to his hand, untapping Circle of Dreams Druid. He taps Circle of Dreams Druid to help activate Yisan for 4. He fetches up a Thought Knot Seer onto the battlefield. Thought Knot enters, and Daquan reveals his hand, and then Jay exiles Ad Nauseam from his hand. Then Dark Ritual resolves, adding 3 black, and then Dosen resolves. Jay casts Natural Order, sacrificing Collector Roof as an additional cost. He fetches up a Temur Sabertooth onto the battlefield. He plays a Forest for turn. He activates Temur Sabertooth, bouncing Quirion Ranger back to his hand. He casts Quirion Ranger. He activates Quirion Ranger, bouncing a Forest to untap Circle of Dreams Druid. He floats mana through Circle of Dreams Druid, then activates Temur Sabertooth, bouncing Quirion Ranger back to his hand. He recasts Quirion Ranger. He activates Quirion Ranger, bouncing a Forest and untapping Yisan. He activates Yisan for 5, fetching up an Ashaya, Soul of the Wild, onto the battlefield. Jay activates Temur Sabertooth, bouncing Quirion Ranger to his hand. He recasts Quirion Ranger. He activates Quirion Ranger, bouncing itself, since it's now a Forest through Ashaya, and untaps Circle of Dreams Druid. He presents a loop of floating mana through Druid and then using Quirion Ranger to untap it by bouncing Quirion Ranger to itself through Ashaya. Using this loop, he adds Infinite Green. He activates Quirion Ranger to untap Yisan. He uses Yisan and Quirion Ranger to verse all the way up to 8 and fetches up a Craterhoof Behemoth onto the battlefield. He activates Temur Sabertooth, bouncing Craterhoof to his hand. He uses his infinite mana to repeatedly cast and bounce Craterhoof, making his army infinitely large. He uses Quirion Ranger to untap all of his creatures. He moves to combat, attacks each opponent with an infinitely large creature with trample, and Jay wins the game. It's Emma's first time playing CEDH, so she gets to start us off. Emma draws a card for turn and plays a Plains. She casts Alseid of Life's Bounty. She passes the turn. Matt draws a card for turn and casts a Jeweled Lotus. He plays an Urza Saga, getting its first counter. He cracks Jeweled Lotus to help cast his commander, Urza, Lord High Artificer. Urza enters, and Matt creates a construct. He casts a Tormod's Crypt. He casts an Arcane Signet. He ends his turn. Alex draws and plays a Command Tower. He casts a Chrome Mox, imprinting Spell Pierce. He ships the turn. Alana draws and plays a Bloodstained Mire. She cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Badlands onto the battlefield. She casts her commander, Rograk, son of Roga. She ends her turn. Emma draws, plays a Canopy Vista, and passes. At the end of Emma's turn, Alana casts Deadly Relic for its alternate cost, targeting Urza. In response, Matt casts Fierce Guardianship for its alternate cost, targeting Deadly Relic. In response, Alex casts Swansong, targeting Fierce Guardianship. Swansong resolves, Fierce Guardianship is countered, and Matt creates a 2/2 bird. Deadly Relic then resolves, destroying Urza. The turn moves to Matt. Matt draws, and in his first main phase, Urza Saga gets another counter. He moves to combat and attacks Alana with the bird and the construct. She takes it, and Matt passes the turn. Alex draws and plays a Mana Confluence. He casts Drannith Magistrate. He ends this turn. Alana draws and plays an Ancient Tomb. She ships the turn to Emma. Emma draws and plays a Plains. She casts Moonblessed Cleric. Cleric triggers, and Emma fetches up Kenrith's transformation onto the top of her library. She moves to combat and attacks Alana with Alseid of Life's bounty. Alana takes it, and Emma gains a life. She passes the turn. Matt draws, and in his first main phase, Urza Saga triggers. He floats a mana and then sacrifices it, fetching up a Soul Ring onto the battlefield. He casts the One Ring. The One Ring enters, and Matt gains protection from everything until his next turn. He activates the One Ring, adding a burden counter and drawing a card. He moves to combat and attacks Alana with everything. She takes it, and Matt ends his turn. Alex draws and plays an Ancient Tomb. He taps Mana Confluence to cast Skirk Prospector. He taps his Ancient Tomb to help cast Wheel of Fortune. In response, Alana casts Calling the Weak, sacrificing Rograk and adding 4 black. Wheel of Fortune then resolves, and each player discards their hand and draws 7. He moves to combat and attacks Alana with Drannith Magistrate. She takes it, and Alex ships the turn. Alana draws and pays 2 life to cast Jitaxian Probe, targeting Alex. She looks at Alex's hand and draws a card. She plays a Watery Grave, and to play untapped, paying 2 life. She casts a Lotus Petal. She taps Ancient Tomb to help cast Talisman of Dominance. She casts a Time Twister. In response, Matt casts Force of Will, paying a life and exiling a blue card, targeting Time Twister. In response, Alex sacrifices Skirk Prospector to cast Pyroblast, targeting Force of Will. Force of Will is countered, and Time Twister resolves. Each player shuffles their hand and graveyard into their library and draws 7. Alana passes the turn. Emma draws and plays a Wooded Foothills. She cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a forest onto the battlefield. She casts Enchantress's Presence. She moves to combat and attacks Alana with everything. Alana takes it, and Emma gains a life. She ships the turn. During his upkeep, Matt loses a life from the One Ring. He draws and plays a Snow-Covered Island. He activates the One Ring, adding a counter and drawing 2 cards. He casts Imposter Mech. Enters the battlefield as a copy of Drannith Magistrate. He casts Grim Monolith. He moves to combat and attacks Alex with everything. Alex takes it, and Matt ends the turn. Alex draws and plays a Steam Vents, and to play untapped, paying 2 life. He casts Mox Opal. He casts Lion's Eye Diamond. He taps his Ancient Tomb to cast a Felwar Stone. He casts a Soul Ring. He casts Ranger Captain of Eos. Ranger Captain enters, and Alex fetches up an Esper Sentinel into his hand. He casts Esper Sentinel. He moves to combat and attacks Alana with Drannith Magistrate. She takes it, and Alex passes the turn. Alana draws and plays a Gemstone Mine. She casts Demonic Tutor. Esper Sentinel triggers, and Alex draws. She then fetches up a card into her hand. She casts Defense Grid. She casts Thassa's Oracle. In response, Alex activates Ranger Captain, sacrificing it. In response, Alana casts Demonic Consultation. In response, Matt casts Force of Negation, exiling a blue card, targeting Demonic Consultation. Esper Sentinel triggers, and Alex draws. With no other answers, Force counters and exiles Consultation. Ranger Captain's ability resolves, then Oracle resolves. Alana looks at the top 2 cards of her library and puts them both on the bottom. With nothing else, and her win attempt thwarted, she ships the turn to Emma. Emma draws and casts Whip Silk. Enchantress's Presence and Esper Sentinel trigger, and Alex and Emma draw. Emma casts Destiny Spinner, and she draws from Enchantress's Presence. She moves to combat and attacks Alex with everything. Alex takes it, and Emma gains 1. She ends her turn. During his upkeep, Matt loses 2 life from the One Ring. He draws and activates the One Ring, adding a counter and drawing 3 cards. He plays a Snow-Covered Island for turn. He casts Karn, the Great Creator. Esper Sentinel triggers, and Alex draws. He activates Karn's first ability, targeting Alex's Chrome Mox, killing it. He moves to combat and attacks Alex with the Construct. Alex blocks with Esper Sentinel, Sentinel dies, and Matt passes the turn. Alex draws and casts Culling the Weak, sacrificing Drannith Magistrate as an additional cost, adding 4 black. He casts Ad Nauseam. With no answers, Ad Naus resolves. Alex reveals a Volcanic Island, Lotus Petal, Grim Monolith, Vampiric Tutor, Misty Rainforest, Gamble, Diabolic Intent, Dockside Extortionist, and a Wheel of Fortune, deciding to stop there. He taps his Mana Confluence to cast Gamble. He fetches up a card into his hand and then randomly discards Vampiric Tutor. He plays a Volcanic Island for turn. He casts Chain of Vapor, targeting Karn. Karn bounces, Matt sacrifices a land to copy the chain, targeting Defense Grid. Defense Grid bounces, and Alana stops the chain. Alex casts Dockside Extortionist. Dockside enters, and in response, Matt casts March of Swirling Mist, exiling a blue card, targeting Dockside and the constructs, phasing them all out. Dockside's trigger resolves, and Alex creates 11 treasures. He taps his Ancient Tomb to help cast Phantasmal Image. Image enters as a copy of Alseid of Life's Bounty. He casts Diabolic Intent, sacrificing the Alseid, fetching up a card into his hand. He casts a Lotus Petal. He casts a Manifold. He casts Grim Monolith. He casts Arcane Signet. He casts Orcish Bowmasters. Bowmasters enters, Matt takes 1, and Alex amasses Orcs 1. Alex casts Enlightened Tutor. In response, Matt pays 2 life to cast Mental Misstep, countering Tutor. Next, Alex casts Wheel of Fortune. With no answers, Wheel resolves. Each player discards their hand and draws 7. Bowmaster's triggers 21 times. Alex deals 2 damage to the bird, 12 at Alana, and 7 at Matt. Alana dies, and Alex puts 21 counters on his orc army. He casts Dark Ritual, adding 3 black. He casts a Spellseeker. It enters, and Alex fetches up a Tainted Pact into his hand. He casts Rhystic Study. Unfortunately unable to close it out, he passes the turn to Emma. Emma draws and plays a Serra's Sanctum. She casts Spirit Mantle. Enchantress's Presence and Rhystic Study trigger. Emma pays for Rhystic, and then she draws a card. Bowmaster's triggers, and Alex targets Alseid of Life's Bounty. In response, Emma floats 4 white through Serra's Sanctum. Then Alseid dies, and Alex amasses 1. Emma casts Retether, and Alex draws through Rhystic. Retether resolves, and Emma returns Canopy Cover, enchanting Destiny Spinner, and Whip Silk, enchanting Moonblessed Cleric. She moves to combat and attacks Alex with everything. Before damage, Emma casts Karamitra's Blessing, targeting Moonblessed Cleric. Rhystic Study triggers, and Alex draws. In response, Alex casts Tainted Pact. He holds priority and sacrifices his Lion's Eye Diamond, discards his hand, and adds 3 blue. Pact resolves, and he exiles cards until he finds Fierce Guardianship, putting it into his hand. He hard casts Fierce Guardianship, targeting Karamitra's Blessing. Blessing is countered, and then Alex takes the damage. Emma ends her turn. During his upkeep, Matt loses 3 life from the One Ring. He draws and activates the One Ring, adding a counter and drawing 4 cards. Bowmaster's triggers and deals 4 damage to Matt, and then Alex amasses 4. He plays a Command Beacon for turn. He cracks his Command Beacon, putting his commander into his hand. He recasts Urza, Lord High Artificer, and Alex draws through Rhystic. Urza enters, and Matt creates a construct. He casts Power Artifact, targeting Grim Monolith, and Alex draws through Rhystic again. Matt pays 2 and untaps Grim Monolith, reduced through Power Artifact. He taps Grim Monolith for 3 colorless. He presents a loop of using Grim Monolith and Power Artifact to create infinite colorless mana. He then presents another loop of tapping Grim Monolith for blue through Urza to create infinite blue mana. He casts Hullbreaker Horror. He casts Mind Over Matter. Hullbreaker Horror triggers and returns Bowmasters to Alex's hand. Matt activates Mind Over Matter, discarding a card and untapping the One Ring. He activates the One Ring, adding a counter and drawing 5 cards. He repeats this process 2 more times, discarding 2 cards, adding 2 counters, and then drawing 13 cards. He casts Spellskite. Hullbreaker Horror triggers, and Matt bounces the Orc army. He casts Sensei's Divining Top. Horror triggers and bounces Rhystic. He casts a Mana Crypt. Horror triggers and bounces Spellseeker. He casts Whir of Invention, where X equals 2, fetching up a defense grid onto the battlefield. He activates Urza over and over, exiling his entire library. He casts Dramatic Reversal and untaps his non-land permanents. He crews Imposter Mech with a construct. He presents a loop of using Hullbreaker Horror to bounce Jeweled Lotus and Urza back and forth to create a very large amount of constructs. He moves to combat and attacks Alex with the Imposter Mech and Emma with a 100,000 construct. They all take it, die, and Matt wins the game. Alex was able to balance a card on his nose the longest and gets to start us off. Alex draws a card for turn and plays a Mana Confluence. He casts a Jeweled Lotus. He passes. TK draws and plays a Wooded Foothills. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Stomping Ground onto the battlefield untapped, paying 2 life. He casts a Mana Crypt. All through, TK ships the turn to Emma. Emma draws and plays a Verdant Catacombs. She cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Temple Garden onto the battlefield untapped, paying 2 life. She casts a Utopia Sprawl, naming white as it enters. Emma ends her turn. Alana draws and plays a Scalding Tarn. She cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up an Underground Sea onto the battlefield. She casts her commander, Rograk, son of Roga. She casts a Springleaf Drum. Alana passes. At the end of Alana's turn, Alex taps his Mana Confluence to cast a Vampiric Tutor. He fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. The turn moves to Alex. Alex draws and casts a Mana Crypt. He sacrifices his Jeweled Lotus to help cast his commander, Kenrith, the Return King. He then taps his Mana Confluence to cast a Gamble. He fetches up a card into his hand and then randomly discards Dockside Extortionist. Super bummed out, Alex ends his turn. During TK's upkeep, he loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays a Breeding Pool into play untapped, paying 2 life. He casts a Mystic Remora. He casts Dockside Extortionist. It enters and TK creates 3 treasures. He then sacrifices Dockside and his treasures to help cast his commander, Dargo the Shipwrecker. He then casts Life's Legacy, sacrificing Dargo as an additional cost. It resolves and TK draws 7 cards. TK passes, discarding the hand size, notably discarding both LED and Brain Freeze. The table gets a good idea of what's in TK's hand, and the turn moves to Emma. Emma draws and plays a command tower. She casts her commander, Sithis, Harvest Hand. She casts Flickering Ward, targeting Sithis. Sithis and Remora trigger, TK draws, and Emma draws a card and gains a life. Flickering Ward resolves, and Emma names red as it enters. Emma passes. At the end of Emma's turn, Alana casts Chain of Vapor, targeting Remora. Remora triggers, and TK draws. Remora is bounced, and TK doesn't continue the chain. The turn moves to Alana. Alana draws and taps Springleaf Drum to help cast Culling the Weak, sacrificing Rograk as an additional cost, adding 4 black. She casts Rhystic Study. She recasts Rograk. All through, Alana ends her turn. Alex draws and plays an Overgrown Tomb into play untapped, paying 2 life. He casts Cabal Ritual, Rhystic triggers, and Alana draws. Ritual resolves and Alex adds 3 black. He activates Kenrith's 5th ability targeting Dockside in his graveyard. Dockside enters and Alex creates 6 treasures. He casts Demonic Consultation, Rhystic triggers, and Alana draws. It resolves and Alex debates between Ad Nauseam and Phantasmal Image. He settles on Phantasmal Image. He exiles the top 6 cards of his library, which includes Ad Nauseam, much to Alex's relief, and then exiles cards until he finds Phantasmal Image and puts it into his hand. He casts Phantasmal Image, having it enter as a copy of Dockside. Phantasmal Extortionist enters, and Alex creates 6 more treasures. He moves to combat and attacks Alana with Kenrith. Alana takes it, and Alex ships the turn to TK. During TK's upkeep, he loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays a Training Center. He casts Mystic Remora, paying for Rhystic. He then casts a Rhystic Study of his own. Alana's Rhystic triggers and she draws. TK passes. At the end of TK's turn, Alex activates Kenrith's 2nd ability targeting Phantasmal Image. Image triggers and Alex sacrifices it. He then activates Kenrith's 5th ability targeting Phantasmal Image. It enters as a copy of Dockside and Alex creates 9 treasures. Alex presents a loop of using Kenrith's 2nd ability, targeting Phantasmal Image to sacrificing it, then using Kenrith's last ability to reanimate Image as a copy of Dockside, netting 2 treasures each time. He repeats this loop to create 69 million treasures. He then uses his numerous treasures to activate Kenrith's 4th ability to draw his entire deck. He casts Silence, locking out his opponents from casting spells this turn. He then uses Kenrith's 4th ability again, targeting each opponent. Each opponent draws their entire libraries, lose, and Alex wins the game. But Alex has a pre-game action and puts Gemstone Caverns onto the battlefield, exiling Spellseeker. TK draws and plays a Tropical Island. He casts Birds of Paradise. He passes. Emma draws and plays a Forest. She casts Burgeoning. She passes. Alana draws and plays a Command Tower. Burgeoning triggers and Emma puts a Plains onto the battlefield. Alana casts her commander, Rograk, son of Rogah. She casts Mox Amber. She casts an Arcane Signet. She casts Ragavan, Nimble Pilferer. Alana passes. At the end of Alana's turn, Emma casts Path to Exile, targeting Ragavan. Ragavan is exiled, and Alana fails to find a basic land. Still in Alana's end step, Alex casts Mystical Tutor. He fetches up an Ad Nauseam onto the top of his library. The turn moves to Alex. Alex draws and plays an Underground Sea. He casts Dark Ritual, adding 3 black. He casts Grim Monolith. He casts Ad Nauseam. Ad Naus resolves, and Alex reveals a Mana Crypt, Dockside Extortionist, Red Elemental Blast, Underworld Breach, Windfall, Chain of Vapor, Mindbreak Trap, Chrome Mox, Toxic Deluge, City of Brass, Savine's Reclamation, Dispel, Volcanic Island, Thassa's Oracle, Scrubland, Taiga, Vampiric Tutor, Command Tower, Grand Abolisher, Jeweled Lotus, Lotus Petal, Kinnan Bonder Prodigy, Force of Will, Tundra, and a Force of Negation, deciding to stop there. He casts Lotus Petal. He casts Chrome Mox, imprinting Red Elemental Blast. He casts Mana Crypt. He casts Dockside Extortionist. It enters, and Alex creates 3 treasures. He casts Kinnan Bonder Prodigy. He casts Underworld Breach. He escapes Lotus Petal. He cracks Lotus Petal for 2 white through Kinnan, and then casts Grand Abolisher. He casts Jeweled Lotus. He sacrifices Lotus, adding 3 white. This produces an additional mana due to Kinnan, and importantly, this mana is not restricted to commanders only. He then uses the 1 floating mana and cracks his last treasure to help cast Windfall. Everyone discards their hand and draws 16 cards. Alex casts Lion's Eye Diamond. He cracks LED, discards his hand, and adds 4 blue. He escapes LED again, cracks it again, this time adding 4 black. He escapes Tainted Pact, exiling his library except for the last 2 cards. He escapes Thassa's Oracle. Oracle enters, and Alex wins the game. Emma draws and plays a Plains. She casts Sigarda's Aid. She passes. Alana draws and plays a Mana Confluence. She taps Mana Confluence to cast Mystic Remora. She casts her commander, Rograk, son of Rogah. She ends her turn. Alex draws and plays a Tropical Island. He casts a Mox Diamond, and Alana draws through Remora. Mox enters, and Alex discards Tarnished Citadel. He casts Kinnan, Bonder Prodigy. All through, he ships the turn to TK. TK draws and plays a Flooded Strand. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Tropical Island onto the battlefield. He casts a Mana Crypt. Remora triggers, and Alana draws. He casts Rhystic Study. Remora triggers, and Alana draws again. Finished up, TK passes to Emma. Emma draws and plays a Forest. She casts Ground Seal. Remora and Rhystic trigger, and TK and Alana draw. Ground Seal enters, and Emma draws a card. With nothing else, she ends her turn. During Alana's upkeep, she taps her Mana Confluence to pay for her Remora. She draws and casts a Mana Crypt. Rhystic triggers, and TK draws. She casts Talisman of Creativity, and TK draws again. She casts Mox Amber, and TK draws again. She plays a Wooded Foothills as her land for turn. She passes to Alex. Alex draws and plays a Mana Confluence. He moves to combat and attacks TK with Kinnan. TK takes it, and Alex ships the turn. During TK's upkeep, he wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and casts Birds of Paradise. He plays a Gaia's Cradle as his land for turn. He casts a Llanowar Elves. Finished up, TK ends his turn. Emma draws and plays a Reliquary Tower. She casts her commander, Sithis Harvest Hand, paying for Rhystic. Emma passes. At the end of Emma's turn, Alana cracks her Wooded Foothills, pays a life, and fetches up a Volcanic Island onto the battlefield. The turn moves to Alana. During Alana's upkeep, Remora and Mana Crypt trigger. She loses their Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. With her Remora trigger still in the stack, she casts Cabal Ritual, adding 3 black. Rhystic triggers and TK draws. Alana then casts Ad Nauseam. Rhystic triggers and TK draws again. With no responses, Ad Naus resolves. Alana reveals an Otawara Soaring City, Yawgmoth's Wail, Soul Ring, Underworld Breach, Deflecting Swat, Windfall, Final Fortune, Mindbreak Trap, Snap, Jessica's Will, Red Elemental Blast, and a Time Twister, deciding to stop there. She then lets her Remora die. She draws and plays a Badlands. She casts a Soul Ring, Rhystic triggers and TK draws. She casts Final Fortune. TK draws but doesn't find an answer, and Final Fortune resolves. Finished up, Alana passes the turn to herself. During her upkeep, Alana wins her Mana Crypt roll. She draws and plays a Verdant Catacombs. She cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up an Underground Sea onto the battlefield. She channels Otawara Soaring City, bouncing Rhystic back to TK's hand. Now completely uninhibited, Alana casts Jessica's Will, choosing both modes, targeting TK. She adds 12 red and exiles Demonic Tutor, Mox Opal, and Gemstone Caverns off at the top of her library. She casts Mox Opal. She casts Demonic Tutor, fetching up a card into her hand. She casts Defense Grid. She casts Underworld Breach. She escapes Orcish Bowmasters. It enters, kills Birds of Paradise, and Alana amasses 1. She escapes Demonic Tutor, fetching up another card into her hand. She escapes Jessica's Will, again targeting TK. She adds 12 red and exiles Flooded Strand, Dark Ritual, and the One Ring off at the top of her library. She casts Wheel of Fortune. Everyone discards their hands and draws 7. Bowmasters triggers 21 times. Alana has Bowmasters deal 8 damage to each Alex and Emma, and then 5 damage to TK, then amasses 21. Alana escapes Wheel of Fortune. Everyone discards their hands and draws 7 again. Bowmasters triggers 21 times again. Alana has Bowmasters deal 7 damage to each of her opponents and then amasses 21. She escapes Wheel of Fortune again. Everyone discards their hands, draws 7. Bowmasters triggers 21 times. Each of Alana's opponents takes 7 damage and then she amasses 21. Alana escapes Jessica's Will, targeting TK. She adds 7 red and then exiles Ragavan, Nimble Pilfer, Necropotence, and Chain of Vapor off of the top of her library. Now, with enough mana, Alana escapes Wheel of Fortune 3 more times, has Bowmasters ping each of her opponents for 7 each time, kills them, and Alana wins the game. But Ashani has a pre-game action, putting Leyline of the Void onto the battlefield. Brandon draws and plays a Flooded Strand. Having learned his lesson from the last game, he casts his commander, Rograk, Son of Roga. He casts Paradise Mantle. He casts a Mana Crypt. He cracks his Flooded Strand, pays a life, and fetches up an Underground Sea onto the battlefield. He equips Paradise Mantle to Rograk. He exiles Simian Spirit Guide from his hand, adding a red. Brandon then casts a Time Twister. After some moans and groans, everyone shuffles their hands and graveyards into their libraries and draws 7. Brandon casts a Mox Amber and finishes his turn. Ashani draws and plays a Command Tower. He casts his commander, Rograk, Son of Roga. He ends his turn. Emma draws and plays a Scrubland. She casts Esper Sentinel. She passes. Alex draws and plays a Mana Confluence. He taps it to cast Skirk Prospector. All through, he ships the turn to Brandon. During his upkeep, Brandon wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and plays a Steam Vents, into play tapped. He casts Conqueror's Flail, paying for Esper. He attempts to equip Flail to Rograk, and in response, Ashani casts Vampiric Tutor. Esper Sentinel triggers and Emma draws. Then Ashani fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. Flail then equips to Rograk, and with nothing else, Brandon passes the turn. Ashani draws and plays a Luxury Suite. He casts a Mana Crypt. Esper Sentinel triggers and Emma draws. He casts a Skull Clamp. He casts a Tangle Wire. Finished up, Ashani passes to Emma. During Emma's upkeep, she taps her permanents through Tangle Wire. She draws and plays an Arid Mesa. She cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Taiga onto the battlefield. She casts a Noble Hierarch and ends her turn. During Alex's upkeep, he taps his permanents through Tangle Wire. He draws and plays a Blood Crypt, into play untapped, paying 2 life. He casts a Mox Opal. Esper Sentinel triggers and Emma draws. All through, Alex ships the turn to Brandon. During Brandon's upkeep, he taps his permanents through Tangle Wire. He then wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and plays a Gemstone Mine as his land for turn. He casts Dockside Extortionist. It enters and Brandon creates 6 treasures. He passes. During Ashani's upkeep, he removes a Fade counter from Tangle Wire, then taps his permanents through Tangle Wire. He then loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and casts Imperial Seal. Esper Sentinel triggers and Emma draws. In response, Brandon casts Swansong, targeting Seal, paying the Esper tax. In response, Ashani casts Red Elemental Blast, targeting Swansong. In response, Brandon hard casts Force of Negation, targeting Imperial Seal. Force counters and exiles Imperial Seal, and then Blast counters Swansong. Next, Ashani casts a Sphere of Resistance. Finished up, Ashani passes to Emma. During Emma's upkeep, she taps her permanents through Tangle Wire. She draws and plays a Mana Confluence. She ends her turn. During Alex's upkeep, he taps his permanents through Tangle Wire. He draws, plays a Tundra, and passes. During Brandon's upkeep, he taps his permanents through Tangle Wire and then wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and plays a Badlands. He casts his commander, Silas Wren, Seeker Adept. All through, Brandon passes to Ashani. During Ashani's upkeep, he removes the Fade counter from Tangle Wire, then taps his permanence through Tangle Wire. He then wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and equips Skull Clamp to Rograk, killing it and drawing 2 cards. He casts a Lion's Eye Diamond, paying for Resper. He passes. At the end of Ashani's turn, Emma taps Mana Confluence to help cast Vampiric Tutor. She fetches up a card onto the top of her library and loses 2 life. The turn moves to Emma. During Emma's upkeep, she taps her permanence through Tangle Wire. She draws and plays a Marsh Flats. She cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Tundra onto the battlefield. She taps Mana Confluence to help cast Dockside Extortionist. It enters, and Emma creates 16 treasures. She casts her commander, Sisay, Weatherlight Captain. She activates Sisay and fetches up a Ragavan, Nimble Pilferer, onto the battlefield. She activates Sisay again and fetches up a Niambi, Esteemed Speaker, onto the battlefield. Niambi triggers, and Emma returns Dockside to her hand. She recasts Dockside, creating 16 more treasures. Brandon begins to regret not sacrificing his treasures as Emma activates Sisay again. She fetches up an Emil the Blessed onto the battlefield. She activates Emil, flickering Dockside. She demonstrates a loop of activating Emil to flicker Dockside, netting more treasures each time, creating infinite treasures. She activates Sisay and fetches up Selvala, Heart of the Wilds, onto the battlefield. She then activates Emil, this time targeting Sisay. Sisay flickers, Selvala triggers, and then Emma draws a card. She then demonstrates another loop of activating Emil to flicker Sisay and drawing a card through Selvala each time Sisay re-enters. She draws her deck and then casts all of her creatures. She then casts Finale of Devastation, where X equals 420,069, and with a nice army at her disposal, Emma moves to combat, attacking her opponents with everything. They all take it, die, and Emma wins the game. Nick won the Blackout Challenge and gets to start us off. Nick draws a card for turn and plays a Misty Rainforest. He passes. Peter draws and plays a City of Brass. He casts a Mana Crypt. He taps his City of Brass to help cast Rhystic Study. In response, Nick casts Force of Will, paying a life, exiling a blue card, countering Rhystic. Peter passes. Ashani draws and plays a Polluted Delta. He casts a Mana Crypt. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Volcanic Island onto the battlefield. He ends his turn. Zach draws and plays an Arid Mesa. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Tundra onto the battlefield. He casts Mox Diamond, discarding City of Traders. He exiles Simeon Spirit Guide from his hand, adding a red. He casts Rhystic Study. Peter groans, Study resolves, and Zach ships the turn to Nick. At the end of Zach's turn, Nick cracks his Misty Rainforest, pays a life, and fetches up an Underground Sea onto the battlefield. Nick draws and plays a City of Brass. He casts Imperial Seal. Rhystic triggers, and Nick taps the City of Brass to pay for it. Then Nick fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. Nick ends his turn. During his upkeep, Peter wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and then taps his City of Brass to help cast out Mystic Remora, paying the Rhystic tax. Peter passes. During his upkeep, Ashani loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and casts Gamble. Rhystic and Mystic trigger, and Peter and Zach draw. Then Ashani fetches up a card into his hand and then randomly discards a Mana Confluence. He plays a City of Brass for turn. He taps it to help cast a Rhystic Study of his own. Peter and Zach draw, then Rhystic resolves. All through, Ashani passes. Zach draws and plays a Morphic Pool. He casts Drannith Magistrate. Rhystic triggers and Ashani draws. Drannith resolves and Zach ships the turn. Nick draws and plays an Ancient Tomb. He taps it to help cast Rhystic Study. Remora and 2 Rhystics trigger, and all 3 players draw. The table straps in, and Nick passes the turn. During his upkeep, Peter loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He also taps his City of Brass to pay for his Remora. He draws and plays a Flooded Strand. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Breeding Pool onto the battlefield untapped, paying 2 life. He casts an Ignoble Hierarch. 3 Rhystics trigger, Peter pays 2, and then Nick draws. With nothing else, Peter passes. During his upkeep, Ashani wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws, plays a Mountain, and passes the turn. Zach draws and plays the City of Brass. Zach ends his turn. Nick draws and passes. During his upkeep, Peter wins his Mana Crypt roll. He also pays to keep his Remora. He draws and taps the City of Brass to help cast Dothy Voidwalker. 3 Rhystics trigger, and all 3 players draw. Peter ends his turn. During his upkeep, Ashani wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and plays a Mountain. He casts a Nizzix Signet. He pays for both Rhystics, and Peter draws through Remora. Ashani passes. Zach draws and plays a Verdant Catacombs. He casts his commander, Timna the Weaver, and both players draw from Rhystic. He moves to combat and attacks Peter with Drannith Magistrate. Peter takes it, and in his second main phase, Zach pays a life and draws a card through Timna. Zach gives the turn to Nick. Nick draws and taps his City of Brass to help cast Counterbalance. Mystic and 2 Rhystics trigger, and all 3 players draw. In response, Peter casts Swansong, and all 3 opponents draw again. Counterbalance is countered and exiled with a Void counter, and Nick creates a 2/2 bird. He plays a Polluted Delta for turn. He taps his Ancient Tomb to help cast Talisman of Dominance, and all 3 opponents draw through Rhystic and Mystic. Finished up, Nick passes. During his upkeep, Peter lets his Remora die. He also wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and plays a Scalding Tarn. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Hallowed Fountain onto the battlefield untapped, paying 2 life. He taps his City of Brass to help cast Grand Abolishers. All Rhystics trigger, and all 3 opponents draw. In response, Ashani casts Cyclonic Rift, targeting Zach's Rhystic. Both Rhystics trigger, and Nick and Zach draw, then Zach's Rhystic is bounced. Then Abolisher resolves. Next, Peter casts Underworld Breach. He attempts to escape Mystic Remora, but Zach reminds him, of the Kenrith Magistrate on the battlefield. Peter sinks his head as he realizes what he just did. With nothing else to do, Peter passes, sacrificing Underworld Breach. During his upkeep, Ashani loses his mana crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays an island. He casts Gilded Drake. Rhystic triggers and Nick draws. In response, Nick cracks his Polluted Delta, pays a life, and fetches up a Watery Grave onto the battlefield untapped, paying 2 life. He taps his Talisman to help cast Drown in the Loch. Rhystic triggers and Ashani draws. In response, Ashani casts Muddle the Mixture, targeting Drown in the Loch. Rhystic triggers and Nick draws. In response, Peter casts Force of Will, paying a life and exiling a blue card, targeting Gilded Drake. Rhystic trigger and Nick and Ashani draw. Force counters Drake, then Muddle counters Drown. Next, Ashani casts Dockside Extortionist and Nick draws from Rhystic. Dockside enters and Ashani creates 4 treasures. He casts Fabricate, Rhystic triggers and Nick draws again. Then Ashani fetches up an Imposter Mech into his hand. He casts Imposter Mech and Nick draws from Rhystic. Imposter Mech enters as a copy of Kenrith Magistrate. He casts a Mox Amber and Nick draws. Ashani passes. At the end of Ashani's turn, Zach cracks his Verdant Catacombs, pays a life, and fetches up an Underground Sea onto the battlefield. He casts Mystical Tutor. Both Rhystic trigger and Ashani and Nick draw. Then Zach fetches up a Culling the Weak onto the top of his library. Ashani discards the hand size, and the turn moves to Zach. Zach draws and plays a Misty Rainforest. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Volcanic Island onto the battlefield. He casts Culling the Weak, sacrificing Tymna as an additional cost. Both Rhystic trigger and Ashani and Nick draw. In response, Peter pays 2 life to cast Mental Misstep. Rhystic trigger and both draw again. In response, Zach casts Swansong, targeting Misstep. Rhystic trigger and both draw again. Swansong counters Misstep. Peter creates a 2/2 bird, then Culling the Weak resolves, and Zach adds 4 black. He casts Ad Nauseam. Rhystic trigger and both players draw. In response, Nick casts Pact of Negation. Rhystic triggers and Ashani draws. In response, Zach casts Force of Will, paying a life and exiling a blue card. Ashani and Nick draw from Rhystic, and in response, Peter casts Flusterstorm with all copies targeting Ad Nauseam. Rhystic triggers and both draw. Ad Naus is countered, and Force counters Pact. Next, Zach taps his City Breast to help cast Rhystic Study. Nick and Ashani draw through Rhystic, Zach's Rhystic resolves, and Zach ends his turn. During his upkeep, Nick casts Limdul's Vault. Both Rhystic trigger and Zach and Ashani draw. He looks at the top 5, doesn't like what he sees, pays a life, and continues the process. He does this 2 more times, paying 2 more life, then shuffling and rearranging the top 5. He draws and plays a snow-covered island. He taps his City of Brass to help cast a Phantasmal Image. Rhystic trigger and Zach and Ashani draw. In response, Ashani taps his City of Brass to help cast Stern Scolding. In response, Nick taps his Talisman to cast Spell Pierce, targeting Stern Scolding. Rhystic trigger and both draw again. In response, Peter casts Mindbreak Trap for its alternate cost, targeting all spells on the stack. Rhystic trigger and both players draw. All are exiled, then Nick follows up by casting Chrome Mox. Rhystic trigger and both players draw. Chrome Mox enters and Nick imprints Stern Scolding. He casts Mox Opal and both draw again. He taps his Ancient Doom to cast an Arcane Signet and both players draw from Rhystic. With nothing else, Nick passes, discarding the hand size into the Void Zone. During his upkeep, Peter wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and casts Demonic Tutor. Rhystic triggers and all 3 players draw. He fetches up a card into his hand. He casts Phantasmal Image. It enters as a copy of Dockside, creating 12 treasures. He taps the City of Brass to cast Cyclonic Rift, targeting Ashani's Drannith. Rhystic triggers and all players draw again. Imposter Mech bounces, and then Peter casts Mayhem Devil. Each player draws through Rhystic, and Mayhem Devil resolves. Peter cracks 3 treasures, floating mana. Mayhem Devil triggers 3 times, killing Zach's Drannith. He casts his commander, Kenrith, the Return King. He sacrifices Dothy Voidwalker, casting Zach's Culling the Weak from exile, sacrificing Phantasmal Image as an additional cost, adding 4 black. He activates Kenrith's last ability, Reanimating Phantasmal Image. It enters as a copy of Dockside, creating 12 more treasures. He cracks 2 treasures, adding 2 green. Mayhem Devil triggers, pinging Zach for 2. He activates Kenrith's second ability, targeting Phantasmal Dockside. It triggers and Peter sacrifices it. Mayhem Devil triggers and deals 1 to Ashani. Peter presents a loop of Reanimated Image, creating treasures through Dockside, then sacrificing it through Kenrith's ability. Each time he cracks a treasure or sacrifices Image, he pings opponents through Mayhem Devil. He does this over and over until the table is dead, and Peter wins the game. Ryan won the Blackout Challenge and gets to start us off. But Alana has a pre-game action, putting Gemstone Caverns onto the battlefield, exiling an island. Ryan draws a card for turn and plays a snow-covered mountain. He casts a Mana Vault. He casts a Metalworker. He passes. At the end of Ryan's turn, Alana casts Pongify, targeting Metalworker. Ryan declares his lifelong grudge against Alana as it resolves. Metalworker is destroyed, and Ryan creates a 3/3 ape. The turn moves to Alana. Alana draws and plays a Cephalid Colosseum. She casts a Jeweled Lotus. She cracks it to cast her commander, Thada Adel Acquisitor. She casts a Mox Amber. She passes. Peter draws and plays a Tarnished Citadel. Peter ends his turn. John draws and plays the Plains. He casts a Chrome Mox, imprinting Felidar Guardian. He casts a Soul Ring. He casts Boromir, Warden of the Tower. John ships the turn. During his draw step, Ryan takes the damage from his Mana Vault. He takes no actions and passes the turn. Alana draws and moves to combat. She attacks Peter with Thada. Peter takes it, Thada triggers, and Alana fetches up the One Ring from Peter's library into exile. In her second main phase, she plays an Ancient Tomb. She taps it to help cast the One Ring from exile. It enters and Alana gains protection from everything. She activates the One Ring, adding a burden counter and drawing a card. Finished up, Alana passes the turn. Peter draws and plays a Volcanic Island. He passes. John draws and casts Serra Ascendant. He moves to combat and attacks Peter with Boromir. Peter takes it and John ends his turn. During his draw step, Ryan takes the damage from his mana vault. He takes no actions and passes the turn. During her upkeep, Alana loses a life to the One Ring. She draws and activates the One Ring. In response, Peter taps Tarnished Citadel to help flash in an Orcish Bowmasters. In response, Alana taps Ancient Tomb and Cephalid Coliseum to help hard cast Force of Will. In response, Ryan casts Red Elemental Blast, targeting Force of Will. Force is countered and Bowmasters resolves. Bowmasters enters, pings Thada, and Peter amasses Orcs 1. Then Alana adds a counter to the One Ring and draws 2. Bowmasters triggers twice, pings Thada twice, killing it, and Peter amasses 2. Alana plays a Mana Confluence and passes to Peter. Peter draws and plays a Marsh Flats. He passes. At the end of Peter's turn, John flashes in a Cathar Commando. John draws and moves to combat. He attacks Peter with Serra Ascendant and Alana with Boromir. They both take it, and John gains 6 life. In his second main phase, John casts Ranger Captain of Eos. It enters, and John fetches up an Esper Sentinel into his hand. John ships the turn to Ryan. During his draw step, Ryan takes a damage from his mana vault. He draws, casts a Manifold Key, and ends his turn. During her upkeep, Alana loses 2 life to the One Ring. She draws and activates the One Ring, adding a counter and drawing 3 cards. Bowmasters triggers 3 times, and Peter targets Ranger Captain with all 3. In response, John sacrifices Ranger Captain, locking out opponents from non-creature spells this turn. Then the Bowmasters trigger fizzles, and Alana plays an island. She taps Ancient Tomb and Mana Confluence to help recast her commander, Thada Adel. Alana passes. At the end of Alana's turn, Peter cracks his Marsh Flats, pays a life, and fetches up a Hollowed Fountain onto the battlefield tapped. Peter draws and plays a Mana Confluence. He taps it to help cast Eladamri's Call. Alana can interact, but cannot do so with Boromir on the battlefield, so the table agrees to band together. In response, John sacrifices Boromir, giving his creatures indestructible until the end of turn. The ring tempts him, and John makes Serra Ascendant his ring bearer. Still in response, Alana casts Force of Negation, exiling a blue card. Then Eladamri's Call is countered and exiled. Next, Peter casts Talisman of Dominance and passes to John. John draws and casts Esper Sentinel. He moves to combat and attacks Alana with Cathar Commando and Peter with Serra Ascendant. They both take it, and John gains 6 life. John passes. During his upkeep, Ryan activates Manifold Key, untapping his mana vault. He draws and plays a Snow-Covered Mountain. He casts Thran Dynamo. Esper triggers, and John draws. Bowmasters triggers, kills Esper Sentinel, and Peter amasses 1. Then Thran Dynamo resolves. Ryan casts Basalt Monolith and passes the turn. At the end of Ryan's turn, John flashes in a Samwise the Stout-Hearted. It enters, John returns Esper Sentinel from his graveyard to his hand, and the ring tempts him. The turn moves to Alana. During her upkeep, Alana loses 3 life to the One Ring. She draws and plays an island. She moves to combat and attacks Thada at Peter. Since Thada has Island Walk, Peter cannot block. Peter takes it, Thada triggers, and Alana fetches up a Wishclaw Talisman into exile. In her second main phase, Alana activates the One Ring. She adds a counter and draws 4 cards. Bowmasters triggers 4 times, targeting Samwise, Cathar Commando, and Thada Adel. Alana floats a blue with Mox Amber, then all creatures die. Then Peter amasses 4. Next, Alana taps Ancient Tomb and Cephalid Coliseum to help cast a Hullbreaker Horror. She casts Mox Diamond. Hullbreaker Horror triggers, bouncing Bowmasters back to Peter's hand. Then Diamond resolves, and Alana discards Manama, School at Water's Edge. Alana casts Soul Ring. Horror triggers, targeting Mox Diamond. In response, John evokes a Solitude, exiling a white card. In response, Alana taps Mana Confluence to cast Chain of Vapor, targeting the Orc army. Hullbreaker Horror triggers, bouncing Solitude back to John's hand. With Chain still in the stack, John evokes Solitude again, exiling a white card. Solitude enters, exiling Hullbreaker Horror. Alana gains 7 life, and Solitude is sacrificed. Then Chain resolves, the Orc army is bounced, and Peter sacrifices a land, continuing the chain, targeting the One Ring. The One Ring bounces back to Peter's hand, and then Alana stops the chain. Then Hullbreaker Horror's trigger resolves, Alana bounces Mox Diamond back to her hand, then Soul Ring resolves. She casts an Arcane Signet. She casts a Mox Diamond, discarding Ottawara, Soaring City. She casts a Wishclaw Talisman from exile. With nothing else, Alana ships the turn to Peter. Peter draws and taps Mana Confluence to help cast the One Ring. It enters, and Peter gains protection from everything. He activates the One Ring, adding a counter and drawing a card. Peter ends his turn. John draws and moves to combat. He attacks Ryan with Serra Ascendant. Ringbearer triggers, and John draws and discards. Then Ryan takes it, and John gains 6 life. In his second main phase, John casts Rule of Law. John passes. During his draw step, Ryan takes a damage from his mana vault. In his main phase, Ryan casts Chaos Warp, targeting Rule of Law. It resolves, John shuffles it into his library, then reveals a Plains, putting it onto the battlefield. Next, Ryan activates Manifold Key, untapping Mana Vault. He casts Dockside Extortionist. It enters, and Ryan creates 9 treasures. He casts Godo, Bandit Warlord. It enters, and Ryan fetches up a Helm of the Host onto the battlefield. Ryan activates Helm of the Host, equipping it to Godo. Ryan moves to combat, creating a copy of Godo Bandit Warlord. It enters, and Ryan fetches up a Hammer of Nazan onto the battlefield. Hammer triggers and equips to his original Godo. Ryan attacks John with his Godo copy. Godo triggers and untaps. John takes it, and in his second combat, Ryan creates another copy of Godo. It enters, and Ryan fetches up a Conqueror's Flail onto the battlefield. It enters, hammer triggers, and equips to the original Godo. Then Ryan attacks John again. Godo triggers and untaps again. Then John takes it, and in his next combat, Ryan creates another Godo. It enters, and Ryan fetches up an Argentum armor onto the battlefield. Hammer triggers, and Ryan attaches it to his newly created copy of Godo. Ryan attacks John with Godo. Godo and Argentum armor trigger, Ryan destroys Peter's mana confluence, then Godo untaps, and John takes the hit. Ryan moves to combat, creates another copy of Godo, and attacks John with both Godos this time. Argentum armor triggers again and destroys Peter's Tarnished Citadel. Ryan presents a loop of attacking John and Alana until they are dead. He continues the loop attacking Peter until he has about 100,000 untapped Godos. Since Peter has protection from everything, he doesn't take any damage. Ryan passes the turn to Peter. During his upkeep, Peter loses a life to the One Ring. He draws and then goes into the tank, trying to decide what to do. He activates the One Ring, adding a counter and drawing 2 cards. He realizes that there is nothing he can do to stop the onslaught, concedes, and Ryan wins the game. Brandon won the Face Wax Challenge and gets to start us off. Brandon draws a card for turn and plays a Turn Timber Serpentine Wood into play tapped. He casts a Chrome Mox imprinting Utopia Sprawl. Brandon passes. Peter draws and plays a Tarnished Citadel. He casts a Mana Crypt. He casts a Soul Ring. He casts a Lotus Petal. He taps Tarnished Citadel to cast a Mystic Remora. Off to a great start, Peter passes the turn. Ashani draws and plays a Flooded Strand. He casts a Jeweled Lotus. Remora triggers and Peter draws. He cracks Flooded Strand, pays a life, and fetches up an Underground Sea onto the battlefield. He cracks his Jeweled Lotus to help cast his commander, Talion the Kindly Lord. It enters, and Ashani names 1. Ashani ends his turn. Drake draws and plays a City of Brass. He exiles Elvish Spirit Guide from his hand, adding a green. He casts a Mana Vault. Remora and Talion trigger, Drake loses 2 life, and Ashani draws, then Peter draws, then Mana Vault resolves. He casts Sensei's Divining Top. Drake loses 2 life, then Ashani and Peter draw again. Drake casts Mox Opal, and Peter draws through Remora. He taps a City of Brass to help cast a Sika, God of the Tree. Talion triggers, Drake loses 2, and Ashani draws a card. Drake activates a Sensei's Divining Top, looking at the top 3 and rearranging. Drake ships the turn. Brandon draws and plays a Forest. He casts his commander, Marwyn the Nurturer. Talion triggers, Brandon loses 2, and Ashani draws a card. Brandon passes. During his upkeep, Peter wins his Mana Crypt roll. He also pays to keep his Remora. He draws and plays a City of Brass. He taps City of Brass and Tarnished Citadel to cast Kinnan, Bonder Prodigy. He casts his commander, Kenrith the Return King. Peter passes the turn. Ashani draws and casts a Soul Ring. Remora triggers and Peter draws. He casts a Talisman of Dominance and Peter draws again. He moves to combat and attacks Peter with Talion. Peter takes it and Ashani passes, discarding to hand size. During his draw step, Drake takes the damage through his Mana Vault. In his main phase, he plays a Bloodstained Mire. He moves to combat and attacks Ashani with a Sika. Ashani takes it and Drake ends his turn. Brandon draws and starts off his turn by casting Embiggen, targeting Marwyn. Remora and Talion trigger, Brandon loses 2 life, then Ashani and Peter draw. Then Marwyn gets +4/+4. He casts a Woodland Bellower. It enters, and Brandon fetches up a Quirion Ranger onto the battlefield. Marwyn triggers and gets a +1/+1 counter. Brandon activates Quirion Ranger, bouncing a forest to his hand and untapping Marwyn. He plays a forest for turn. He casts an Umbral Mantle. Remora triggers and Peter draws. In response, Drake activates his top, rearranging the top 3. He cracks Bloodstained Mire, pays a life, and fetches up a Plateau onto the battlefield. He activates top again, rearranging the top 3. Then Umbral Mantle resolves. Brandon activates Umbral Mantle, equipping it to Marwyn. He activates Umbral Mantle, untapping Marwyn, giving it +2/+2 until the end of turn. Brandon presents a loop of tapping Marwyn for mana and untapping her with Umbral Mantle. He makes more and more green mana until Marwyn's power is at 38. He casts Rishkar's Expertise, paying for Mystic Remora. In response, Drake taps his City of Brass to cast Thought Scour, targeting himself. Remora and Talion trigger, Drake loses 2, and then Ashani and Peter draw. Peter loves what he drew, so in response, Peter casts Mindbreak Trap, targeting Rishkar's Expertise and Thought Scour. Then both are exiled. Brandon moves to combat and attacks Peter with Marwyn. Peter blocks with Kenrith, and Brandon ends his turn. At the end of Brandon's turn, Ashani pays 4 life to cast Dismember, targeting Kennen. In response, Peter exiles Elvish Spirit Guide from his hand, adding a green. He casts Worldly Tutor. Talion triggers, and Peter loses 2 when Ashani draws. Then Peter fetches up a Dockside Extortionist onto the top of his library. Then Kennen dies, and the turn moves to Peter. During his upkeep, Peter wins his Mana Crypt roll. He also pays to keep his Remora. He draws and plays an Exotic Orchard. He casts Dockside Extortionist. Talion triggers, Peter loses 2, and Ashani draws. In response, Drake activates his Sensei's Top, drawing a card and putting top on top. Then Dockside enters, and Peter creates 7 treasures. He taps City of Brass to help cast Soul Partition. In response, Drake casts Deflecting Swat for its alternate cost, targeting Soul Partition. In response, Peter taps Tarnished Citadel to cast Flusterstorm with all copies targeting Deflecting Swat. Talion triggers, Peter loses 2, and Ashani draws. Then Flusterstorm counters SWAT, and Soul Partition exiles Dockside. Peter recasts Dockside from exile. Talion triggers, Peter loses 2, and Ashani draws a card. Dockside enters and Peter creates 7 more treasures. He casts Witchclaw Talisman. He activates Witchclaw, fetching up a card into his hand and giving Witchclaw to Drake. He casts Finale of Devastation where X equals 2. He fetches up a Thassa's Oracle onto the battlefield. Oracle enters and with the trigger on the stack, Peter casts Tainted Pact. Peter exiles all but the last card of his library. Oracle's trigger resolves, and Peter wins the game. Ashani draws a card for turn and plays an Underground Sea. He casts a Mana Crypt and passes. Drake draws and plays a Misty Rainforest. He casts a Jeweled Lotus. He cracks it to cast his commander, Isika, God of the Tree. He cracks Misty Rainforest and pays a life. In response, Ashani flashes in an Opposition Agent. Agent resolves and then Ashani fetches up an Underground Sea from Drake's library into exile. Drake casts a Mox Amber and ends his turn. Brandon draws and plays a Forest. He casts a Soul Ring and ships the turn to Peter. Peter draws and plays a Marsh Flats. He casts a Mana Crypt and passes to Ashani. During his upkeep, Ashani loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays an Underground Sea from exile. He casts his commander, Talion the Kindly Lord. Talion enters and Ashani chooses 1. He moves to combat and attacks Peter with Opposition Agent. Peter takes it and Ashani passes. Drake draws and moves to combat. He attacks Peter with Isika. Peter takes it and in his second main phase, Drake casts Serum Visions. Talion triggers and Drake loses 2 life and Ashani draws a card. Then Drake draws and scries 2. Drake ends his turn. Brandon draws and plays a Forest. He casts his commander, Marwyn the Nurturer. Talion triggers, Brandon loses 2, and Ashani draws. Brandon passes. During his upkeep, Peter wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws, takes no actions, and passes the turn. During his upkeep, Ashani wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and moves to combat. He attacks Drake with Talion and Opposition Agent. Drake takes it, and in his second main phase, Ashani plays a Misty Rainforest. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Watery Grave onto the battlefield untapped, paying 2 life. He casts Arcane Signet. He casts Mox Opal. Ashani passes to Drake. Drake draws and moves to combat. He attacks Ashani with Isika. Ashani takes it, and in his second main phase, Drake casts Manamorphose. He adds 2 mana and draws a card. He casts Lavinia, Azorius Renegade. Drake ships the turn. Brandon draws and plays a Wirewood Lodge. He casts an Umbral Mantle. In response, Ashani casts an Offer You Can't Refuse. Mantle is countered, and Brandon creates 2 treasures. Next, Brandon casts Invigorate, targeting Marwyn. In response, Ashani casts Cyclonic Rift, targeting Marwyn. Marwyn bounces, Invigorate fizzles, and Brandon passes the turn. During his upkeep, Peter loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays a Hallowed Fountain into play untapped, paying 2 life. He passes. During his upkeep, Ashani loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He attacks Drake with Talion and Peter with Opposition Agent. They both take it, and Ashani passes the turn. Drake draws and moves to combat. He attacks Ashani with Isika and Lavinia. Ashani takes it, and in his second main phase, Drake casts Opt. Talion triggers, Drake loses 2, and Ashani draws. Then Drake scries 1 and draws a card. He exiles Simian Spirit Guide from his hand, adding a red. He casts Dockside Extortionist. Talion triggers, Drake loses 2, and Ashani draws a card. Dockside enters, and Drake creates 5 treasures. He casts Ranger Captain of Eos. Ranger Captain enters, and Drake declines to search. Drake ships the turn to Brandon. Brandon draws and plays a Forest. He recasts Marwyn. Talion triggers, Brandon loses 2 life, and Ashani draws. Brandon passes. During his upkeep, Peter loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws, still can't do anything, and passes, discarding to hand size. During its upkeep, Ashani wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and casts Mnemonic Betrayal. It resolves and all opponents' graveyards are exiled. He plays an Ancient Tomb for turn. He casts Serum Visions from exile. He draws and scries 2. He casts Dark Ritual, adding 3 black. He taps Ancient Tomb to cast Manamorphose from exile, adding 2 blue and drawing a card. He casts Opt from exile. He scries 1 and draws another card. He casts Mayhem Devil from exile. He moves to combat and attacks Peter with Opposition Agent and Drake with Talion. They both take it, and Ashani passes, the cards are returned to graveyards, and Ashani discards to hand size. During its upkeep, Drake activates Ranger Captain of Eos, sacrificing it. Mayhem Devil triggers, dealing 1 to Dockside. Ashani bargains with Peter, saying that this is the turn where Drake attempts to win. If Peter can crack his fetch, he can kill Dockside before Drake goes off. So in response, Peter cracks his Marsh Flats and pays a life. Mayhem Devil triggers and deals 1 to Dockside. Then Ashani fetches up an Underground Sea into exile. With Ranger Captain's ability still in the stack, Ashani casts Shadow of Doubt. In response, Drake casts Banishing Knack, targeting Isika. Talion triggers, Drake loses 2, and Ashani draws. Knack resolves, and with Shadow still on the stack, Drake taps Isika, targeting Opposition Agent through Banishing Knack. Agent is bounced, and with Shadow still on the stack, Drake casts Vampiric Tutor. Talion triggers, Drake loses 2, and Ashani draws. In response, Peter casts Flusterstorm with all copies targeting Vampiric Tutor. Tutor is countered, then Shadow resolves, and Ashani draws, then Ranger Captain's ability resolves. Drake draws for turn and pays 2 life to cast Gitaxian Probe, targeting Ashani. Talion triggers, Drake loses 2, and Ashani draws a card. Then Drake looks at Ashani's hand and draws. Next, Drake cracks a treasure. Mayhem Devil triggers, killing Marwyn. He cracks 2 more treasures for mana. Mayhem Devil triggers twice, killing Lavinia. Drake casts Savine's Reclamation, targeting Dockside in his graveyard. Dockside enters the battlefield, and Drake creates 5 treasures. Drake cracks 2 treasures, and Mayhem Devil kills Dockside. Drake cracks 3 more treasures, and Mayhem Devil pings Isika 3 times. Drake flashes back Savine's Reclamation, targeting Dockside Extortionist. Dockside enters, Drake copies Savine's, returning Ranger Captain of Eos to the battlefield. Dockside triggers, and Drake creates 5 treasures. Finished up, Drake passes. Brandon draws and casts Kogla, the Titan Ape. It enters and fights Mayhem Devil, killing it. Brandon passes the turn. During his upkeep, Peter loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and passes the turn. During his upkeep, Ashani loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. Still in his upkeep, Ashani casts Limdol's Vault. He looks at the top 5, doesn't like what he sees, pays a life, and does it again. He does it 5 more times, paying 5 life. He then rearranges the top 5. He draws and plays a Cephalid Coliseum for turn. He casts a Laboratory Maniac. He taps Ancient Tomb to cast Sakashima the Imposter. It enters as a copy of Dockside, and Ashani creates 8 treasures. He casts Thassa's Oracle. It enters, and in response, Ashani casts Tainted Pact. He exiles all but the last 2 of his library. Oracle enters, and Ashani wins the game. Ryan won the Savage Challenge and gets to start us off. Ryan draws a card for turn and plays a Snow-Covered Mountain. He casts a Mana Crypt. He casts Bergi, God of Storytelling. He passes. Zach draws and plays a Windswept Teeth. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Tundra onto the battlefield. He casts Mystic Remora and passes the turn. Peter draws and plays a Mana Confluence. He ends his turn. Chris draws and plays a Shattered Skull, the Hammer Pass, and to play untapped, paying 3 life. He casts a Mana Crypt. Remora triggers and Zach draws. He casts a Mox Opal and Zach draws again. He casts his commander, Jessica, Thrice Reborn, and Zach draws. He activates Jessica's first ability, targeting Ryan's Bergi. The table prepares for war, and Chris gives the turn to Ryan. During his upkeep, Ryan wins his Mana Crypt flip. He draws and plays a Snow-Covered Mountain. He moves to combat and attacks Zach with Bergi. Zach takes 9 damage due to Jessica, and Ryan ships the turn. During his upkeep, Zach pays to keep his Remora. He draws, plays a Mana Confluence, and passes. At the end of Zach's turn, Peter taps his Mana Confluence to cast a Worldly Tutor. Remora triggers, and Zach draws. In response, Zach pays 2 life to cast Mental Misstep, countering the spell. Zach discards the hand size, and the turn moves to Peter. During his upkeep, Peter taps his Mana Confluence to cast Vampiric Tutor. Remora triggers, and Zach draws a card. He fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. He draws for turn and casts a Mana Crypt. Remora triggers, and Zach draws. Peter casts a Lotus Petal, and Zach draws again. He cracks Petal to cast Ristic Study, and Zach draws from Remora. In response, Zach casts Force of Will, paying a life and exiling a blue card, countering the spell. Unfortunately blown out, Peter passes. During his upkeep, Chris loses his Mana Crypt flip and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays an Emergence Zone. He casts Jessica's Will, choosing both modes, targeting Zach. Remora triggers, and Zach draws. Then Chris adds 10 red and exiles Pyroblast, Mountain, and an Ancient Tomb. He casts Pyroblast, targeting Mystic Remora. Remora triggers, and Chris pays. Remora is destroyed, and Chris follows up with a Strike It Rich, creating a treasure. He casts Relic of Legends. He casts his commander, Dargo the Shipwrecker. He activates Jessica's first ability, targeting Bergi. Chris ends his turn. During his upkeep, Ryan loses his Mana Crypt flip and takes 3 damage. He draws and casts Brass Squire. He moves to combat and attacks Zach with Bergi. Zach takes 9 through Jessica, and Ryan passes. At the end of Ryan's turn, Zach casts Enlightened Tutor, fetching up an Underworld Breach onto the top of his library. Zach draws and plays a Volcanic Island. He casts a Lotus Petal. He casts a Chrome Mox, imprinting Vampiric Tutor. He casts an Underworld Breach. In response, Peter casts Mindbreak Trap. The table goes wild as Underworld Breach is exiled. Next, Zach taps his Mana Confluence to cast Wishclaw Talisman and then chips the turn to Peter. During his upkeep, Peter wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and taps Mana Confluence to help cast Durannith Magistrate. Peter passes to Chris. During his upkeep, Chris wins his Mana Crypt flip. He draws and plays a Mountain. He activates Jessica's first ability, targeting Dargo. He moves to combat and attacks Zach with Dargo. Unfortunately, Zach cannot block, takes 21 commander damage, and Zach loses the game. Chris gives the turn to Ryan. During his upkeep, Ryan wins his Mana Crypt flip. He draws and plays a Snow-Covered Mountain. He holds open blockers and passes the turn. During his upkeep, Peter loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and passes the turn. During his upkeep, Chris wins his Mana Crypt flip. He draws and plays a City of Traders. He activates Jessica's first ability, targeting Dargo. He moves to combat and attacks Ryan with Dargo. Ryan blocks with Bergi and takes 12 through Jessica. Chris passes to Ryan. During his upkeep, Ryan loses his Mana Crypt flip and takes 3 damage. He draws and moves to combat. He attacks Jessica with Brass Squire. Jessica dies, and Ryan passes. At the end of Ryan's turn, Peter taps Mana Confluence to cast Tainted Pact. He exiles from the top of his library until he exiles an Underworld Breach, putting it into his hand. The turn moves to Peter. During his upkeep, Peter loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and taps Mana Confluence to cast an Underworld Breach. He escapes Lotus Petal from his graveyard. He cracks it to help cast a Brain Freeze, with all copies targeting himself. He mills 9 cards. He escapes Lotus Petal and cracks it for a blue. He escapes Lotus Petal again and cracks it for another blue. He escapes Brain Freeze with all copies targeting himself, milling 18. He escapes and cracks Lotus Petal 4 more times, adding 4 blue. He escapes Brain Freeze, milling the rest of his library. He escapes Thassa's Oracle. It enters, and Peter wins the game. In this game, Zach's opening hand contains a Polluted Delta, Imperial Seal, Flooded Strand, Demonic Tutor, Simian Spirit Guide, Steam Vents, and an Arid Mesa. Peter's opening hand contains a Talisman of Dominance, Enlightened Tutor, Tainted Pact, Mana Vault, Esper Sentinel, Hallowed Fountain, and an Exotic Orchard. Chris's opening hand contains a Professional Facebreaker, Overmaster, Tybalt's Trickery, Mountain, Dwarven Ruins, Phyrexian Altar, and his Lena Mulligan is a Direfleet Daredevil. Ryan's opening hand contains a Manifold Key, Sandstone Needle, Wheel of Misfortune, Cloudstone Curio, Basalt Monolith, Grim Monolith, and his Lena Mulligan is a Karn the Great Creator. And Zach gets to start us off. Zach draws and plays a Bloodstained Mire. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up an Underground Sea onto the battlefield. He casts an Imperial Seal. He fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. Zach passes. Peter draws and plays a Hallowed Fountain into play untapped, paying 2 life. He casts an Esper Sentinel and passes the turn. Chris draws and plays a Dwarven Ruins into play tapped. He ends his turn. Ryan draws and plays a Sandstone Needle into play tapped as well. Ryan passes. Zach draws and plays an Arid Mesa. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Tundra onto the battlefield. He exiles Simeon's Spirit Guide from his hand, adding a red. He casts Rhystic Study. Esper triggers and Peter draws. Zach ships the turn. During his upkeep, Peter casts Enlightened Tutor. Rhystic triggers and Zach draws a card. Then Peter fetches up a Mystic Remora onto the top of his library. He draws and plays an Exotic Orchard. He casts Mystic Remora. Rhystic triggers and Zach draws. He moves to combat and attacks Zach with Esper. Zach takes it and Peter passes. Chris draws and plays an Urza Saga, getting its first counter. He passes the turn. Ryan draws and plays a Snow-Covered Mountain. He stares at 3 draw engines and ships the turn to Zach. Zach draws and plays a Morphic Pool. He casts his commander, Timna the Weaver. Zach ends his turn. During his upkeep, Peter pays to keep his Remora. He draws and plays a Mana Confluence. He taps it to cast a Mana Vault, paying for Rhystic. Peter passes to Chris. Chris draws, and in his first main phase, Urza Saga gets another counter. He plays a Cavern of Souls, naming Goblin as it enters. He casts a Professional Facebreaker. Rhystic triggers and Zach draws. Chris gives the turn to Ryan. Ryan draws and casts Jessica's Will, targeting Zach. Remora, Esper, and Rhystic trigger. Peter draws 2, and Zach draws 1. Jessica's Will resolves, and Ryan adds 9 red. He casts Grim Monolith. Mystic and Rhystic trigger, and each player draws. He casts Manifold Key, and both draw again. He casts Basalt Monolith, and both draw again. He casts Wheel of Misfortune. Both players draw, then Wheel resolves. Each player secretly chooses a number, reveals them, then Ryan takes 5 damage, and Ryan discards his hand and draws 7. Next, Ryan plays a City of Traders. He casts a Soul Ring. Rhystic and Remora trigger, Peter draws, and Ryan pays for Rhystic. He casts an Arcane Signet, and both players draw. With nothing else, Ryan passes. Zach draws and moves to combat. He attacks Ryan with Timna. Ryan takes it, and Zach gains 2. In his second main phase, Zach pays a life and draws a card through Timna. He plays a Volcanic Island for turn. He casts Gamble. Remora and Esper trigger, and Peter draws 2. In response, Peter casts Pact of Negation. Rhystic triggers, and Zach draws. In response, Zach casts a Pact of Negation of his own, targeting Peter's Pact. Remora triggers, and Peter draws. Pact counters Pact, and Gamble resolves. Zach fetches up a card into his hand, and then randomly discards a Culling the Weak. He casts Silence. Remora triggers, and Peter draws. In response, Peter casts Force of Negation, exiling a blue card, targeting Silence. Rhystic triggers, and Zach draws a card. In response, Zach casts Force of Will, paying a life and exiling a blue card. Remora triggers, and Peter draws a card. With no other actions, Force counters Force, and Silence resolves. Zach casts Cabal Ritual with Threshold, adding 5 black. Remora triggers, and Peter draws. He casts an Ad Nauseam. He reveals a Windswept Heath, Phantasmal Image, Chrome Mox, Snap, Mana Confluence, Intuition, Mental Misstep, Mystic Remora, Misty Rainforest, Demonic Consultation, Windfall, Chain of Vapor, Scalding Tarn, Lion's Eye Diamond, Grim Tutor, Gemstone Caverns, Wheel of Fortune, Felwar Stone, Exotic Orchard, Arcane Signet, Vampiric Tutor, Diabolic Intent, Talisman of Progress, Ragavan Nimble Pilferer, Rite of Flame, Verdant Catacombs, and Address Town, deciding to stop there. He casts Chrome Mox, imprinting Fire Covenant. He casts Rite of Flame, adding 2 red. He casts a Soul Ring. He casts an Arcane Signet. He casts a Lion's Eye Diamond. He casts Chain of Vapor, targeting Soul Ring. It bounces. Zach sacks a land to continue the chain, bouncing Chrome Mox. He sacks a land and bounces Arcane Signet to his hand. He sacks a land, bouncing Rhystic to his hand. He sacks his final land, bouncing Timna to his hand, and stops the chain. He casts Soul Ring. He casts Chrome Mox, imprinting Dress Down. He casts Windfall. Each player discards their hand and draws 31 cards. He casts Mox Opal. He casts Lotus Petal. He casts a Mana Crypt. He casts Dockside Extortionist. It enters, and Zach creates 9 treasures. He casts Thassa's Oracle. It enters, and in response, Zach casts Tainted Pact, exiling his library. Oracle's trigger resolves, and Zach wins the game. Peter did the best 2C slide and gets to start us off. Peter draws a card for turn and plays a Savannah. He casts a Noble Hierarch and passes. Nick draws and plays an Arid Mesa. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Savannah onto the battlefield. He casts an Avacyn's Pilgrim. Nick passes. Zach draws and plays a Scrubland. He casts a Dark Ritual, adding 3 black. He casts a Soul Ring. He casts an Arcane Signet. He casts a Mox Opal. He casts a Lion's Eye Diamond. He casts Wheel of Fortune. He holds priority, sacrifices LED, discards his hand, and adds 3 black. In response, Peter casts Mindbreak Trap for its alternate cost, exiling Wheel of Fortune. Next, he casts his commander, Timna the Weaver. Unfortunately disrupted, and with no cards in hand, Zach ends his turn. Zeb draws and plays a Flooded Strand. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Scrubland onto the battlefield. He casts Serra Ascendant. Zeb ships the turn to Peter. Peter draws and plays a Bloodstained Mire. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up an Underground Sea onto the battlefield. He casts a Rhystic Study. Peter ends his turn. Nick draws and plays a Sunbaked Canyon. He casts a Mana Crypt. Rhystic triggers and Peter draws. He casts Sardian Avenger. Peter draws through Rhystic, and Nick passes the turn. Zach draws and casts his other commander, Crom Ludovic's Opus. Rhystic triggers and Peter draws. Zach moves to combat and attacks Peter with Tymna and Nick with Crom. They both take it, and Zach gains 2 life. In his second main phase, Zach pays 2 life and draws 2 cards through Tymna. Zach ships the turn. Zeb draws and plays a Bright Climb Pathway. He casts his commander, Lotho Corrupt Sheriff. Rhystic triggers and Peter draws. Zeb moves to combat and attacks Peter with Serra Ascendant. Peter takes it, and Zeb gains 6 life. Zeb passes the turn. Peter draws and plays a Volcanic Island. He casts Ignoble Hierarch. He casts Ragavan Nimble Pilferer. Lotho triggers and Zeb loses a life and creates a treasure. Peter casts a Witchclaw Talisman and passes the turn. At the end of Peter's turn, Nick flashes in an Aven Mind Sensor. Rhystic triggers and Peter draws. The turn moves to Nick. During his upkeep, Nick wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and plays a Windswept Heath. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Taiga onto the battlefield. He taps Silent Clearing to help cast Sanctum Prelate. Rhystic triggers and Peter draws a card. Sanctum enters and Nick names 1. He casts Boromir, Warden of the Tower. Lotho and Rhystic trigger, Peter draws, and Zeb loses a life and creates a treasure. Nick moves to combat and attacks Zach with Sardian Avenger. Zach takes 8, and Nick ships the turn. Zach draws and moves to combat. He attacks Zeb with Tymna. Zeb takes it, and Zach gains 2 life. In his second main phase, Zach pays a life and draws a card through Tymna. He plays a City of Traders for turn. He casts a Talisman of Creativity, paying for Rhystic. Zach ends his turn. Zeb draws, takes no actions, and passes. Peter draws and plays a Taiga. He casts Eladamri's Call. In response, Zeb cracks a treasure to flash in an Archivist of Ogma. Sardian Avenger triggers and Zeb loses a life. Rhystic triggers and Peter draws. In response, Peter casts Snap, targeting Aven Mind Sensor. Lotho triggers and Zeb loses a life and creates a treasure. Mind Sensor is bounced, and Peter untaps 2 lands. Then Peter fetches up a Dockside Extortionist into his hand. Archivist of Ogma triggers, and Zeb gains a life and draws a card. He casts Dockside Extortionist. In response, Zeb cracks 2 treasures to help cast Abeyance. Lotho and Sardian Avenger triggers, Zeb loses 2, and then loses 1 more and creates a treasure. In response, Peter exiles Simian Spirit Guide from his hand, adding a red. He activates Witchclaw Talisman, fetching up a card into his hand and giving Witchclaw to Zeb. Archivist of Ogma triggers, and Zeb gains a life and draws a card. Abeyance resolves, and Zeb draws another card. Then Dockside resolves. It triggers, and in response, Zeb cracks his treasure. Sardian Avenger triggers, and Zeb loses a life. Then Peter creates 6 treasures. Peter casts Phantasmal Image. It enters as a copy of Dockside, and Peter creates 6 more treasures. He cracks 5 treasures, loses through life through Avenger, and then casts his commander, Kenrith, the Return King. With nothing else, Peter passes to Nick. During Nick's upkeep, his Mana Crypt triggers. In response, Peter cracks 2 treasures to cast Final Fortune. Zardian Avenger triggers, and Peter loses 2 life. Then Nick loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays a Flooded Strand. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Plateau onto the battlefield. Archivist triggers, and Zeb gains a life and draws a card. He taps Sunbaked Canyon to help cast his commander, Jetmir, Nexus of Revels. Rhystic triggers, and Peter draws a card. He moves to combat and attacks Peter with Sardian Avenger. Avenger triggers, and in response, Peter cracks a treasure. Avenger triggers, and Peter loses a life. Then Avenger gets +9/+0. Peter blocks with Phantasmal Image. Image dies, and the turn moves to Peter. Peter draws and exiles Elvish Spirit Guide from his hand, adding a green. He casts Wheel of Fortune. In response, Nick flashes in an Aven Mind Sensor. Rhystic triggers, and Peter draws. Aven resolves, then Wheel resolves. Everyone discards their hand and draws 7 cards. Next, Peter casts Underworld Reach. Lotho triggers, and Zeb loses a life and creates a treasure. Peter escapes Snap, targeting Sardian Avenger. Sardian bounces, and Peter untaps 2 lands. He escapes Snap again, targeting Aven Mind Sensor. Sensor bounces, and Peter untaps 2 lands again. He casts Mana Crypt. Boromir triggers and counters the spell. He casts Lotus Petal, and it gets countered by Boromir again. Now, Peter has enough cards in his graveyard, so he escapes Wheel of Fortune. In response, Zach taps his Talisman to cast Snap, targeting Sanctum Prelate. Rhystic triggers, and Peter draws. Sanctum bounces, and Zach untaps 2 lands. Still in response, Zach casts Flusterstorm with all copies targeting Wheel. Lotho and Rhystic trigger, Zach pays, then Zeb loses a life and creates a treasure. In response, Peter casts Vampiric Tutor. He fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. Archivist of Ogma triggers, and Zeb gains a life and draws a card. Then Flusterstorm counters Wheel of Fortune. Next, Peter escapes Phantasmal Image. It enters as a copy of Dockside. In response, Zeb cracks his treasures. Then Peter creates 6 treasures of his own. He plays a Tarnished Citadel for turn. He casts Eldritch Evolution, sacrificing Phantasmal Image as an additional cost. In response, Zeb casts Reprieve. Rhystic triggers, and Peter draws. In response, Peter casts Swan Song. Reprieve is countered, Zeb creates a 2/2 bird, then Evolution resolves. Peter fetches up a Displacer Kitten onto the battlefield. Archivist triggers, and Zeb gains a life and draws a card. Next, Peter casts Finale of Devastation where X equals 0. Displacer Kitten triggers and flickers Dockside, then Peter creates 6 more treasures. Then Finale resolves and Peter fails to find. Archivist triggers and Zeb gains a life and draws a card. Next, Peter escapes Wheel of Fortune. Displacer Kitten triggers, Peter flickers Dockside, and Peter creates 6 more treasures. Then everyone discards their hand, with Peter discarding Thassa's Oracle, and then draws 7. He casts Ranger Captain of Eos. It enters, and Peter declines to search. He cracks Ranger Captain, locking out opponents this turn. He casts Gamble. Displacer Kitten flickers Dockside, and Peter creates 6 more treasures. He fetches up a card into his hand, and then randomly discards a Tainted Pact. He casts Red Elemental Blast targeting Crom. Displacer Kitten flickers Dockside, Peter creates 6 treasures, and Crom is destroyed. He escapes Thassa's Oracle. It enters, and in response, he escapes Tainted Pact, exiling his library. Oracle's trigger resolves, and Peter wins the game. Nick draws and plays a Wooded Foothills. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Savannah onto the battlefield. He casts an Avacyn's Pilgrim, and passes. Zach draws and plays a Scrubland. He casts a Lotus Petal. He exiles Simeon's Spirit Guide from his hand, adding a red. He casts his commander, Timna the Weaver. Zach passes. Zeb draws and plays a City of Brass. He casts a Chrome Mox, imprinting Cabal Therapy. He taps his City of Brass to help cast his commander, Lotho, Corrupt Sheriff. Zeb ends his turn. Peter draws and plays a Scalding Tarn. He casts a Mana Crypt. He cracks Scalding Tarn, pays a life, and fetches up a tropical island onto the battlefield. He casts a Mystic Remora. Lotho triggers and Zeb loses a life and creates a treasure. Peter ships the turn. Nick draws and plays a Guy's Cradle. He casts Esper Sentinel. Nick passes. Zach draws and plays a Verdant Catacombs. He moves to combat and attacks Peter with Timna. Peter takes it, and Zach gains 2 life. In his second main phase, Zach pays a life and draws a card through Timna. Zach gives the turn to Zeb. Zeb draws and plays a Bright Climb Pathway. He moves to combat and attacks Peter with Lotho. Peter takes it, and Zeb passes. During his upkeep, Peter loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He also pays to keep his Remora. He draws and casts Birds of Paradise. Peter passes the turn. Nick draws and plays an Arid Mesa. He cracks it and pays a life. In response, Zeb taps City of Brass to flash in an Archivist of Ogma. In response, Zach cracks his Verdant Catacombs, pays a life, and fetches up an Underground Sea onto the battlefield. Archivist resolves, and then Nick fetches up a Plateau onto the battlefield. Archivist triggers, and Zeb gains a life and draws a card. Next, Nick casts Professional Facebreaker. He moves to combat and attacks Zach with Esper and Peter with Avacyn's Pilgrim. They both take it, Facebreaker triggers, and Nick creates 2 treasures. Nick ends his turn. Zach draws and moves to combat. He attacks Peter with Timna. Peter takes it, and Zach gains 2 life. In his second main phase, Zach loses a life and draws a card through Timna. He plays a Command Tower and passes the turn. At the end of Zach's turn, Zeb casts Enlightened Tutor. Remora and Esper trigger, Zeb pays, then Peter draws. Then Zeb fetches up a Bolas's Citadel onto the top of his library. The turn moves to Zeb. Zeb draws and casts Culling the Weak, sacrificing Archivist of Ogma as an additional cost. Mystic and Esper trigger, and both players draw. Then Zeb adds 4 black. He taps City of Brass to help cast Bolas's Citadel. Lotho and Remora trigger, Peter draws, then Zeb loses a life and creates a treasure. With no answers, Bolas's Citadel resolves. Zeb pays a life to cast Serra Ascendant from the top of his library through Bolas's Citadel. He pays a life to cast Springleaf Drum through Citadel. Remora triggers and Peter draws. He pays 2 life to cast Demonic Tutor through Citadel, and Peter draws again. In response, Peter casts Force of Negation, exiling a blue card targeting Demonic Tutor. Esper triggers and Nick draws. Then Demonic Tutor is countered and exiled. Next, Zeb pays a life to cast Mana Vault through Citadel, and Peter draws through Remora. He plays Takanuma, Abandoned Mire through Citadel as his land for turn. He pays 7 life to cast Peer into the Abyss. Remora triggers, and in response, Zach casts Deflecting Swat for its alternate cost, targeting Peer. Remora and Esper trigger, and in response, Zeb pays 2 to cast Soul Partition through Citadel, targeting Mystic Remora. Remora triggers, and Peter draws. Remora is exiled, and still in response, Zeb pays 2 life to cast Fracture through Citadel, targeting Peter's Mana Crypt. Crypt is destroyed, then Zach pays for Esper, and then Peter draws from Remora. Then SWAT resolves, changing the target of Peer from Zeb to Zach. Then Peter draws from Remora, then Peer into the Abyss resolves. Zach loses half of his life and draws 44 cards. Zeb casts Orzhov's Signet. He moves to combat and attacks Zach with Lotho. Zach takes it, and Zeb ends his turn. Peter draws and plays a Mana Confluence. He casts Chrome Mox. Esper triggers, and in response, Zach casts Snap, targeting Lotho. Esper triggers, and Nick draws again. In response, Peter casts Dark Ritual. Lotho triggers, and Zeb loses a life and creates a treasure. Then Peter adds 3 black. Peter flashes in, and Orcish Bowmasters. It enters, pings Lotho, killing it, and Peter amasses Orcs 1. Then Snap fizzles, and Nick draws from Esper. Bowmasters triggers, pings Zach, and Peter amasses 1. Then Chrome Mox resolves, and Peter imprints Final Fortune. Next, Peter casts a Mana Vault. He casts an Arcane Signet. He casts a Wheel of Fortune. In response, Zach casts Fierce Guardianship. In response, Peter taps Mana Confluence to cast Demonic Consultation. In response, Zach pays 2 life to cast Mental Misstep, countering Consult. Then Fierce counters Wheel, and Peter passes the turn. Nick draws and plays an Exotic Orchard. He casts his commander, Jetmir, Nexus of Revels. In response, Zach casts Force of Will, paying a life and exiling a blue card. Esper triggers, Nick draws, Bowmasters triggers, pings Zach, then Peter amasses 1. Jetmir is countered, and Nick moves to combat. He attacks Zack with Facebreaker, Zeb with Sentinel, and Peter with Avacyn's Pilgrim. They all take it, Facebreaker triggers, and Nick creates 3 treasures. In his second main phase, Nick casts Archon of Valor's Reach, naming instant as it enters. He casts Birds of Paradise and ships the turn to Zack. Zack draws and moves to combat. He attacks Zeb with Tymna. Zeb takes it, and Zack gains 2 life. In his second main phase, Zack pays a life and draws a card through Tymna. Bowmaster's triggers, pings Zack, and Peter amasses 1. Zack plays a Plateau for turn. He casts Dockside Extortionist. It enters, and Zack creates 9 treasures. He casts Phantasmal Image. It enters as a copy of Dockside, and Zack creates 9 more treasures. He channels Otawara, Soaring City, bouncing Archon back to Nick's hand. Zack casts Silence. Esper triggers, and Zack pays. Then Silence resolves, locking out opponents this turn. Zack casts Mox Diamond, discarding a Misty Rainforest. He casts a Mana Crypt. He casts a Soul Ring. He casts a Mana Vault. He casts a Grim Tutor. He fetches up a card into his hand and then loses 3 life. He casts Demonic Tutor, fetching up another card into his hand. He casts Thassa's Oracle. It enters, and in response, Zack casts Demonic Consultation, exiling his library. Oracle's trigger resolves, and Zack wins the game. Brandon won the game of Can't Touch This and gets to start us off. But Alana has a pre-game action, putting Gemstone Caverns onto the battlefield, exiling Scalding Tarn. Brandon draws a card for turn and plays a Forest. He casts a Mana Crypt. He casts his commander, Marwyn the Nurturer. He casts a Lotus Petal. He cracks it to cast Delighted Halfling. Brandon passes. Ashani draws and plays a Manama, School at Water's Edge. He passes. Alana draws and plays a Verdant Catacombs. She cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up an Underground Sea onto the battlefield. She casts Arcane Signet. She casts her commander, Rograk, son of Roga. She casts Paradise Mantle. She equips Mantle to Rograk and ships the turn to Peter. Peter draws, plays a Command Tower, and passes. During his upkeep, Brandon loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and casts an Elvish Mystic. Marwyn triggers and gets a +1/+1 counter. He casts Selvala, Heart of the Wilds. Marwyn triggers and gets another counter. Brandon ends his turn. Ashani draws and plays a Mana Confluence. He taps it to help cast out Counterbalance. He casts Chromox, imprinting Stern Scolding. Ashani passes the turn. Alana draws and casts a Mana Crypt. Counterbalance triggers, and Ashani reveals a Dark Ritual. Alana plays a Marsh Flats for turn. She cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Badlands onto the battlefield. She casts Praetor's Grasp, targeting Peter. She fetches up a card from Peter's library into exile face down. She casts the One Ring from exile. It enters, and Alana gains protection from everything. She activates the One Ring, adding a burden counter and drawing a card. Alana ships the turn. Peter draws and plays an Underground Sea. He casts Phantasmal Image. It enters as a copy of Selvala. Peter passes. During his upkeep, Brandon wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and casts his own One Ring. It enters, and Brandon gains protection from everything. He activates the One Ring, adding a counter and drawing a card. He casts a Jeweled Lotus and ships the turn to Ashani. Ashani draws and plays a Cephalid Colosseum for turn. He taps it to help cast a Rhystic Study. Ashani ends his turn. During her upkeep, Alana loses a life to the One Ring. She also wins her Mana Crypt roll. She draws and activates the One Ring, adding a counter and drawing 2 cards. She plays a Watery Grave into play untapped, paying 2 life. She casts her other commander, Silas Wren, Seeker Adept, paying for Rhystic. Alana gives the turn to Peter. Peter draws and plays a Badlands. He casts a Witchclaw Talisman. Counterbalance and Rhystic trigger, and in response, Alana flashes in an Orcish Bowmasters. Rhystic triggers and Ashani draws. It enters, pings Delighted Halfling, and Alana masses Orcs 1. Then Ashani draws through Rhystic, Bowmasters triggers, kills Halfling, and Alana amasses. Then Ashani reveals an Opposition Agent through Counterbalance, and Witchclaw resolves. He activates Selvala, adding 2 white to cast Grand Abolisher. Counterbalance and Rhystic trigger, Ashani draws, Bowmasters triggers, pings Elvish Mystic, and Alana amasses. Then Ashani reveals a land off of Counterbalance, and with Abolisher still in the stack, Brandon hard casts Force of Vigor, targeting Rhystic and Counterbalance, paying for Rhystic. In response, Ashani taps Mana Confluence to cast a Swan Song. Force is countered, and Brandon creates a 2/2 bird. Then Abolisher resolves, and Peter passes the turn. During his upkeep, Brandon loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He also loses a life to the One Ring. He draws and activates the One Ring, adding a counter and drawing 2. Bowmasters triggers twice, kills Grand Abolisher, and Alana amasses 2. Brandon casts Leaf Crown Visionary, paying for Rhystic. Marwyn triggers and gets a +1/+1 counter. He casts Rishkar's Expertise, paying for Rhystic again. Then Brandon draws 5 cards and casts Dusk Watch Recruiter. Counterbalance, Rhystic, and 5 Bowmasters trigger. Alana kills Marwyn, amasses 5, Ashani draws through Rhystic, Bowmasters triggers, Alana targets Peter's Selvala, and Phantasmal Image triggers, and then Peter sacrifices it. Then Ashani ignores Counterbalance, and Recruiter resolves. Brandon plays Gaia's Cradle for turn. Finished up, Brandon passes. Ashani draws and plays a Morphic Pool. He casts a Jeweled Lotus. He cracks it to help cast his commander, Talion the Kindly Lord. It enters, and Ashani chooses 1. Ashani ends his turn. During her upkeep, Alana loses 2 life to the One Ring. She also wins her Mana Crypt roll. She draws and activates the One Ring. In response, Ashani casts Dark Ritual, adding 3 black. He flashes in a Notion Thief. It enters, and in response to the One Ring, Alana casts Snap, targeting Notion Thief. Counterbalance and Rhystic trigger, Alana doesn't pay, and Ashani declines to draw due to Bowmasters. Then Ashani reveals a copy artifact through Counterbalance, countering the spell. Then Alana adds a counter, and Ashani draws 3 cards through Notion Thief. Bowmasters triggers 3 times, kills Notion Thief, pings Talion twice, and Alana amasses 3. Next, Alana casts Mystic Remora, paying for Rhystic. Talion and Counterbalance triggers, and Ashani reveals Demonic Consultation, countering Remora. Then Alana loses 2, and Ashani draws a card through Talion. She moves to combat and attacks Ashani with Silas and her Orc army. Ashani takes 16, and Alana ends her turn. Peter draws and plays a Flooded Strand. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Tundra onto the battlefield. He activates Wishclaw, fetching up a card into his hand and giving Wishclaw to Ashani. He casts Silence. Rhystic, Talion, and Counterbalance trigger. Ashani reveals a Flesh Duplicate, then Peter loses 2, and Ashani draws. Bowmasters triggers, Alana pings Ashani, amasses 1, then Ashani draws through Rhystic. Bowmasters triggers again, Alana pings Ashani again, and amasses 1. In response to Silence, Brandon activates Duskwatch Recruiter, looking at the top 3, failing to find. Then Brandon casts Crop Rotation, sacrificing a forest as an additional cost. Rhystic, Counterbalance, and Talion trigger, Brandon loses 2 and Ashani draws. Bowmasters triggers, Alana pings Ashani, amasses 1, then Ashani reveals a Mana Drain through Counterbalance, then Ashani draws through Rhystic, and Crop Rotation resolves. Brandon fetches up an Ancient Tomb onto the battlefield. Then Silence resolves, locking out opponents this turn. Peter casts Dockside Extortionist. Counterbalance, Rhystic, and Talion trigger, Peter loses 2 and Ashani draws. Bowmasters triggers, Alana pings Ashani and amasses 1, Ashani draws through Rhystic. Bowmasters triggers again, Alana pings Ashani and amasses 1 again, then Ashani reveals a Trick Bind, countering Dockside. Unfortunately stopped through Counterbalance, Peter passes the turn. During his upkeep, Brandon loses 2 life to the One Ring. He also wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and plays a Yavimaya, Cradle of Growth for turn. He casts Autumn's Veil. Counterbalance, Rhystic, and Talion trigger, Brandon loses 2 and Ashani draws. Alana pings Ashani through Bowmasters and amasses 1. Brandon pays for Rhystic, then Ashani reveals a Dispel through Counterbalance, countering the spell. Brandon activates the One Ring, adding a counter and drawing 3 cards. Bowmasters triggers 3 times, Alana pings Ashani for 3, and then amasses 3. He casts Scale Up, targeting Duskwatch Recruiter. Talion and Counterbalance trigger, Ashani reveals a Dispel, countering Scale Up. Brandon loses 2 and Ashani draws, then Bowmasters pings Ashani and Alana amasses. He casts Finehorn Elves. Counterbalance, Rhystic, and Talion trigger, Brandon loses 2 and Ashani draws, and Alana pings Ashani with Bowmasters and amasses 1. Then Ashani ignores Rhystic and Counterbalance, and Elves resolves. He taps his Ancient Tomb and cracks his Jewel Lotus to help recast his commander, Marwyn the Nurturer. Counterbalance, Rhystic, and Talion trigger, Brandon loses 2 and Ashani draws, Alana pings Ashani through Bowmasters and amasses 1, and Ashani ignores Rhystic and Counterbalance. Brandon moves to combat and attacks Ashani with everything. Ashani blocks Selvala with Talion and takes the rest. All through, Brandon passes. Ashani draws and plays an Underground River. He activates Wishclaw. In response, Alana casts Demonic Consultation. Counterbalance, Rhystic, and Talion trigger. Alana loses 2 and Ashani draws. Alana pings Ashani with Bowmasters and amasses 1. Ashani declines to draw through Rhystic and then reveals an Imposter Mech through Counterbalance. In response, Ashani casts Dispel, countering Consult. Then Ashani fetches up a card into his hand and gives Wishclaw to Peter. Ashani taps his Cephalid Coliseum to help cast Thassa's Oracle. It enters, and with the trigger on the stack, Ashani taps his Mana Confluence to help cast Tainted Pact. Ashani exiles all but the last 3 cards of his library, putting Cyclonic Rift into his hand. Oracle's trigger resolves, and Ashani wins the game. Ashani draws and plays a Blood Crypt into play untapped, paying 2 life. He casts a Deathrite Shaman and passes the turn. Alana draws and plays an Ancient Tomb. She casts her commander, Rograk, son of Rogah. She taps Ancient Tomb to help cast a Springleaf Drum. She casts Infernal Plunge, sacrificing Rograk as an additional cost, adding 3 red. She casts the One Ring. In response, Peter casts Mindbreak Trap for its alternate cost, exiling the One Ring. Disappointed, Alana passes the turn. Peter draws and plays a City of Brass. He taps it to help cast a Birds of Paradise. Peter ends his turn. Brandon draws and plays a Forest. He casts Boreal Druid and ships the turn. Ashani draws and plays a Misty Rainforest. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Bayou onto the battlefield. He activates Deathrite Shaman, exiling his Misty Rainforest from his graveyard, adding a black. He casts Necropotence. Ashani activates Necropotence 7 times, paying 7 life, exiling 7 cards. He moves to his end step and puts the Necro cards into his hand. He passes, discarding the hand size, exiling the discarded cards. Alana draws and taps Ancient Tomb to help recast her commander, Rograk, son of Rogah. She plays a command tower for turn. She casts Demonic Tutor, fetching up a card into her hand. Alana gives the turn to Peter. Peter draws and plays a Tropical Island. He taps City of Brass to help cast a Wishclaw Talisman. Peter passes to Brandon. Brandon draws and plays a Forest. He casts his commander, Marwyn the Nurturer. He passes. Ashani skips his draw step due to Necropotence. He plays a Nurturing Peatland for turn. He casts Ragavan, Nimble Pilferer. He activates Necropotence 10 times, paying 10 life, exiling 10 cards. He moves to his end step and puts the Necro cards into his hand. He casts Dark Ritual, adding 3 black. He casts Cabal Ritual, adding 3 more black. He casts Entomb, fetching up a Squee the Immortal into his graveyard. He taps Nurturing Peatland to help cast Assassin's Trophy, targeting Marwyn. Marwyn is destroyed, and Brandon fetches up a forest onto the battlefield. Then Ashani activates Deathrite Shaman, exiling Alana's Demonic Tutor, and each opponent loses 2 life. Then Ashani discards the hand size, exiling the discarded cards. Alana draws and plays a Verdant Catacombs. She casts Wheel of Fortune. In response, Brandon casts Force of Vigor for its alternate cost, exiling a green card, targeting Necropotence and Witchclaw Talisman. Both are destroyed, then Wheel resolves. Each player discards their hand and draws 7. Next, Alana cracks Verdant Catacombs, pays a life, and fetches up an Underground Sea onto the battlefield. She casts a Mana Crypt. Alana ends her turn. Peter draws and casts Chrome Mox, imprinting Sabine's Reclamation. He taps City of Brass to help cast Culling Ritual. In response, Alana casts Flusterstorm with all copies targeting Ritual, countering the spell. Peter passes. Brandon draws and plays a Gaia's Cradle. He recasts his commander, Marwyn the Nurturer. Brandon ends his turn. Ashani draws and moves to combat. He attacks Peter with Ragavan. Peter takes it, Ragavan triggers, Ashani creates a treasure, and Peter exiles a Snap off of the top of his library. In his second main phase, Ashani plays a Polluted Delta. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up an Overgrown Tomb onto the battlefield untapped, paying 2 life. He activates Deathrite Shaman, exiling Polluted Delta, adding a black. He casts a Culling Ritual of his own. Each non-land permanent with mana value 2 or less is destroyed, and Ashani adds 3 green and 4 black. He casts Ad Nauseam. Ashani reveals a Final Fortune, Mana Crypt, Command Tower, Worldly Tutor, Wheel of Fortune, Exotic Orchard, City of Brass, Veil of Summer, Rite of Flame, Raid of Filth, Taiga, Beseiju Who Endures, and an Underworld Breach, deciding to stop there. He casts Rite of Flame, adding 2 red. He casts Mana Crypt. He casts Final Fortune, getting an extra turn. He casts his commander, Corvold, Fey Cursed King. It enters, and Ashani sacrifices Nurturing Peatland. Corvold triggers, gets a +1/+1 counter, and Ashani draws. Ashani moves to his next turn, discarding the hand size. During his upkeep, Ashani loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays an Exotic Orchard. He casts Underworld Breach. He casts Rain of Filth. He sacrifices Blood Crypt to Rain of Filth, adding a black. Corvold triggers, gets a counter, and Ashani draws. He sacrifices Overgrown Tomb, adding a black, drawing through Corvold. He escapes Cabal Ritual with Threshold, adding 5 black. He escapes Animate Dead, returning Dosen, the Falling Leaf, from his graveyard to the battlefield. He casts Food Chain. He activates Food Chain, exiling Corvold, adding 6 red. He casts Squee from his graveyard through its ability. He exiles Squee to Food Chain, adding 4 red. He presents a loop of casting and exiling Squee over and over, netting infinite red. He uses that red to repeat the loop, adding infinite black and infinite green. He escapes Mayhem Devil. He recasts his commander, Corvold, sacrificing Squee and drawing a card through Corvold, pinging Alana through Mayhem Devil. He escapes Entomb, fetching up Skirk Prospector into his graveyard. He escapes Skirk Prospector. He activates Skirk, sacrificing Squee, adding a red. Mayhem Devil triggers and pings Alana. He presents a loop of casting Squee from his graveyard with his infinite mana, then sacrificing it to Skirk for a red, pinging an opponent. He does this over and over until the table is dead, and Ashani wins the game.